this story to let you all know that the paranormal is a very scary and real thing. Although it draws considerable skepticism, and I must admit, sometimes it does seem a bit far-fetched, you can't dismiss the millions of eyewitness accounts from people all over the world who've experienced something supernatural. My story is a little short, but it's further evidence, at least to me, that ghosts in fact are real and authentic. I was living with my wife in a house that we recently purchased. It was an old home from the Victorian era, and we lived in the countryside. The house was spacious and incredibly massive, and had one of the biggest basements I'd ever seen in my life. But this house also had a dark side to it. When the lights went out, disturbing sounds of footsteps and voices could be heard all around. Faint echoes, nothing too loud, and every now and again, you'd hear and see doors slowly open and close. There was a moment when my wife was in the shower. Nobody was home but her, and she thought I'd come in to greet her. She heard the door slowly opening and called out my name. She moved the shower curtain to see who it was, but nobody was there. The only thing she had witnessed was the door slowly move open, and in the moment, she thought she saw a dark cloud move across the door. Creepy thing is, the door was locked. When I finally came home, she told me to stop playing games and that she knew I was messing with her. I insisted I wasn't messing with her at all. Another day she was in the shower. The door opened once again, and someone shut off the lights. She screamed and raced to turn them back on, and could have sworn she heard a heavy breathing from the moment the lights were shut off to when she turned them back on. We had this old piano in the living room. My wife loves to play, and many years before we married, I'd gotten her this beautiful antique piano. We had been sleeping one night in bed when we were woken by the sounds of the piano notes being played menacingly. When I say play, I mean that the piano sounded as if it was being sat on again and again. Like if someone got up, sat down on the piano, got up again, and sat down. The sound of multiple notes were being pushed down at the same time. It wasn't pleasant. I went downstairs to check it out, and I saw nothing. I waited to see if it would happen again, in front of my face, and I said to myself, bullcrap, just our minds messing with us. Until I saw one note being pushed down, by itself. The scariest moment happened when I again heard noises coming from the basement, although this time, it wasn't the sound of footsteps, but mumbling and gargling noises. I mean, it truly sounded as if someone was gargling water. In fact, it sounded like a mix of mumbling drunk talk and this gargling. You couldn't identify what was being said. Although I was terrified, I went down to investigate. Walking down the stairs, I see the outline of a dark shadow slowly move from one side of the basement into the other, only to vanish entirely. Even though it bothered me a great deal, I just went back to bed right after and had a strange dream. I was in that same house, and nearly the same scenario that happened in real life played out in my dream. I go down to the basement, only this time I see 3 clowns all drinking together in a circle and muttering obscenities and whispers. I yelled to get out of my house. They all turned to me with the most sinister grin and just pointed at me. One of the clowns spoke, and then I heard it say, "He needs to be sacrificed." That's when I woke up petrified. The creepiest part of this dream was that we found out that years ago, there was a man who used to live in this house, and guess what? He used to work as a clown in the circus. He was a loner who lived completely isolated as an alcoholic. One day, he had enough of his life and went into the basement, where he was never heard from again. He ended up living his entire life in misery, alone and deserted. He was found by the police after a neighbor was concerned about a rotting smell. Right next to our house was actually a graveyard. We eventually moved from out of the house that I was talking about and into another one in downtown Portland, Oregon. My wife waited until we moved to tell me one last story she'd been saving, as to not upset me further. On more than one night, she had seen an old man visit the graveyard next door. He wore an old leather hat and had an old clothes similar to those worn in the pioneering days. He carried an old leather pouch and would just stand there in the graveyard staring at our house. When we would leave, he would walk down the middle of the street. My wife got in the car to follow him, but around the corner, he vanished. He always came, but you never saw him coming. He was always just there. After a while, she stopped looking, afraid of his blank stare. It took us a while to realize, but we suspect that the man in the grave was the clown visiting his own grave. I think he regrets what he did to himself and wishes he could go back. When I was a young man in my early 20s, I used to work at a hotel that had a grisly past. I always worked the night shift, and I was no stranger to the unusual sounds and disturbances at night. This hotel was built in the early 1930s, and people often reported seeing an older couple in Victorian-era clothing walking down the hallway on the 5th floor before ultimately disappearing. Long ago, a woman was drowned to death by her own husband after he caught her cheating on him with another man in the hotel. He ended up knocking her out while she was sleeping, filled the bathtub up with water, and suffocated her under the water. He then fell to his death by jumping out of the window. This was in room 455. There were times where I had to go by myself to get the room prepared for guests the night before, and I swear, I'd hear two people whispering every time I'd walk into the room. I even heard my name being called once before, and it sent shivers up my spine. I can remember an incident where I went up to the 5th floor. The door was opened, but nobody was in there. Scared but curious, I walked into the room and noticed that the bathroom light was on and the bathtub was running. I shut off the water and the lights go out by themselves, and I heard the door slam shut. I hear the sound of glass breaking. My heart starts racing, and I instinctively scream. I turn on the light, walk out of the bathroom, and I kid you not, there was a face print on the window in the hotel room for what seemed like 30 seconds, and it just slowly disappeared. I couldn't make out anything specific, whether it looked male or female, but it was definitely a face. I had a coworker once tell me that she went into that same room, and she swears to this day that she thought she saw a woman laying in the bathtub. As she got closer and walked up to the bathroom, nothing was there, but again, the light was on when nobody had been there at all. There is also something really creepy about the hotel elevator. People report seeing an old elevator operator just waiting for you to get in before disappearing completely. Usually, you would see the elevator open by itself, and the man would be staring from afar, and as you get closer, he fades away. I remember going in that elevator many times, and I'd feel like there was a presence right behind me. In the summertime, it always felt so cold in that elevator, and I feel like I've seen a face in the reflection of that elevator mirror. In the basement of the hotel, there is a storage room that once used to be a bar many years ago. Whenever anybody worked, they were always reluctant to head down to the basement because it always made you feel uneasy. People have reported chatter in the basement when completely alone, and at times heard glass shatter. Another employee claimed to have witnessed a dark cloud just standing in the corner of the basement. Anywho, I hope you enjoyed this short story about these hotel incidences. I'm really happy that I don't work the night shift anymore, because it's incredibly creepy. Yorktown, Colonial Parkway, Yorktown, Virginia, 1970. It's been years. I don't believe in an afterlife, but the shared experiences of a detailed calm hysteria leaves us talking even today. The three people today continue to describe the uniforms, the hollow sunken faces, the slumped shoulders, and the look of complete and total submission in an eternity of dread that wrapped around each soldier. We were lost on the parkway in that very small town, around the battlefield. I hadn't had my driver's license that long, which created anxiety. The two people with me were concerned about the lack of turning room on the second well-maintained road, and the fog kept getting heavier and heavier. The headlights picked up soldier after soldier, walking towards us on either side of the road, not even looking at us, but straight ahead, with such exhaustion. I mentioned their gray uniforms. The uniforms were not well kept, and that struck me as being unusual. I've been around the military all my life. These were not current issue uniforms. It never occurred to us that these men fit the description of ghosts, except for their facial expressions. We all agreed that when I got the car turned around without getting stuck somehow, maybe we should give these guys a lift. I found that place to turn around, and the headlights abruptly focused on a man dressed in a gray uniform with a yellow sash. And why I think this must be a shared hysteria, a tri-corner hat. We all remarked that the uniform must have been a strange mixture of colonial and Civil War staging. But the night was so cold, and why would so many men go to so much trouble for a part of the parkway that wasn't even being traveled that night? The three of us tried to figure out who started the conversation of ghosts. We didn't discuss ghosts, because at that time, we didn't believe in them. But somehow, we were able to share a feeling that we, or one of us, transferred into a very large, very real, shared mirage of dynamic proportion. And that's what haunts us today. What is in the human mind that could project such images to other people? How could we have seen, simultaneously, in such detail, these soldiers who looked so dead? Maybe that was the key word for our hysteria. We tested each other. What did the soldier and the turnaround look like? I knew. I only had to hear it from the other two. And so, if this was a prank, congratulations, guys. You've held our interest for years. But was it really worth the expense and makeup for one lost car in an empty, two-lane foggy parkway? My husband has been cleaning this church for 3 years, and he, as well as the rest of our family, has experienced some very strange things. So has at least one other member of the church. First, it was just a feeling of a presence that you just couldn't shake, a glimpse of a shadow from the corner of your eye, and the occasional sound that could not be explained. My husband worked his regular job from 4 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. and would go to the church after leaving his job, and that was when he would experience most of the things. Then, it didn't seem to matter what time of day it was, and it even started happening when the kids would be there helping. Our two boys are now 9 and 12, and we never said anything to them for fear of scaring them. They were in the upstairs room where my husband was cleaning, and suddenly, the piano started playing one note over and over for a minute or so, and then it stopped. The boys were very frightened, but also very intrigued by the whole thing. I've been a victim of Henry, as we affectionately call him now. I've heard many things, little bumps and unexplainable noises. Our 19-year-old son took over the cleaning job for about 6 months this past summer, and he's also heard many things. Things like footsteps in front of him, doors on other floors slamming, and other little things like that. He also went to clean in the middle of the night, mainly because it is easier to do when no one is there to get in the way, or so he thought. When my husband took the job back over, it wasn't very long before he would start experiencing Henry again. Oh, did I mention that he would always seem to find dimes lying in the oddest places, sometimes as many as $2 worth in a few hours of cleaning, never finding them in places where people would frequent in the building. We never felt we needed to fear Henry, since his presence never seemed to be a threatening experience. But there was a woman who has been a longtime member of the church. She was there one day by herself doing the books, when she had heard moaning to the point of causing her to call the police, because she really felt that someone was there. My husband had arrived while the police were in the building. They had asked the woman to wait outside in case they found someone, but needless to say, that no one was there to be found. They kinda humored the woman, but my husband told her of his experiences, and she said that this wasn't the first time that things have happened to her there either. The most disturbing thing was when he was in the boiler room, cleaning some mops before he left, and me and my two sons were outside warming the car, and suddenly, he came running to the car with a horrified look on his face, and shaking tremendously. I could tell something was terribly wrong, but he didn't want to frighten the boys, so he waited to tell me after we were able to be alone. He had revealed to me that he actually saw two men walking down the stairs in the back of the boiler room, talking to each other as if he wasn't there at all. They were dressed in the style of the 20s and seemed to be almost floating down the steps. There isn't any way to enter the room from that door, since it is locked very securely. We have had many of the people we have told these things to try to explain them away, but there is no human explanation for these things. There's been times when we went there and left only after a few minutes because there is a sense of something just not being right. I come from a family that my mother and sister always had experiences. I also had times where I know the other side is present in my life. My 4-year-old nephew had come with us one day, and the children were all playing in the preschool room for about an hour. The next time we took our nephew, which was only the second time he'd ever been there with us, they were in the gym playing. He came out in the hall and asked me where the big fella was at. I was shocked that he would say that, since the only people there on both trips he made with us was us. I didn't want to frighten him, so I just asked about the big fella, and to which he responded, "You know, the big fella that was here the last time we were playing." Well, I feel that this is really all that needs to be said to explain just who or what is there in this church. A child that doesn't know what we have all experienced can hardly imagine the same thing if it isn't so. Right before the Christmas of 1999, I had what I can only call a weird experience. I'm a firm believer in ghosts and the supernatural, and have been told I am psychic, as well as experience unusual things. However, I'd never seen anything until that night. For whatever reason, I woke up around 3 a.m. to see a man in my bedroom doorway. I live alone, and my 2 cats were asleep on my bed. My first thought was an intruder, and I remember quickly screaming and reaching with one hand for my phone, and the other for the reading lamp on my bed's headboard. The man was rather large and was wearing jeans and a green plaid shirt. Just as quickly as I saw him, he turned around and silently walked out of my room. After a minute, I got out of my bed with my phone and walked around my apartment. No one was there, and there were no unlocked doors or windows. What is so unusual is, if it was a true stranger, my cats would have darted under my bed because they are not used to strange men. Maybe it was a dream, but I doubt it. This was too real and scary. I live in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half north of Harrisburg. This story happened to Nancy, a coworker of mine. She was seeing a guy named Dave who had heard stories about an old abandoned house north of the city where strange things were said to have occurred. It was set back at the end of a dirt road, quite a distance from the highway, next to an old railroad track. This old brick house was supposed to have been used as a temporary hospital for Civil War soldiers. I don't know whether these soldiers were Confederate prisoners or wounded Union soldiers on their way north. Word of mouth had it that a group of people went inside to look around. When someone commented on the view from the bathroom, his companion led him back to the room and showed him the same window, which was, in fact, bricked over. Dave convinced Nancy that they should check it out. They drove out to the road, over the railroad tracks, and parked in front of the old house. It looked so foreboding that Nancy, who was driving, decided she didn't want to go inside, so she turned around to head back. They didn't get far, because the car stalled on the railroad tracks. Surprised and half jokingly, Dave asked Nancy what she was doing. "Nothing," she said, as she frantically tried to restart the engine. "I'm not doing anything." Nancy turned the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't catch. Suddenly, they were surrounded by a fog so deep they couldn't see in front or in back of them. Nancy panicked and scrambled for the door handle, but Dave restrained her, saying, "You're not going anywhere." Then, they heard the train whistle. Nancy and Dave looked to the right and saw the glare of the single headlight coming directly towards them. Nancy put her head forward, closed her eyes, and gripped the steering wheel as tight as she could. She screamed and braced herself for the collision, but all she felt was a swoosh, like something going right through her. She described it as an energy force passing right through her body. Immediately afterward, the fog blew away, as if by magic. Nancy grabbed the keys in the ignition, turned it, and the engine started up with no problem. Nancy jammed her foot down on the accelerator, and the tires squealed as she drove away as fast as she could. That was the presence of a ghost train. I'd been tormented, scared out of my mind, and had jokes played on me for years on end by what I and my friends and family believe to be some kind of entity or spirit. I don't wish to become anyone's school paper or test subject. I would just like some advice to maybe deal with the problem. It all started when I was 9 years old and my father sent me to bed. I was never really scared of the dark, so my father would allow me to tuck myself in at night. But this night, it was going to be different. My mom was on the top floor of a 3-story house, and I never made it to the 3rd story. I thought I saw something move in the darkness of the 3rd floor, and then I heard very clearly someone say my name. There was one particular moment on the stairs in the house where I would see the apparition of a fog just gliding through the stairs, up and down. And another time, I could have sworn I heard the voice of a little boy saying, "Come over here." I also got really bad sleep paralysis, and that same boy that I thought I heard would appear over my bed and choking me. I would resist. I would try to scream as loud as I could, but to no avail. Nobody could hear me, and the boy was just choking me. He had the look of evil in his eyes, and actually, his face was half disfigured. It really looked like his face was melted off entirely. And then I would awake, and I'd be lying in my bed, in my room in the dark. For the nights after that, I would constantly hear the boy whisper in my ear, over and over again. I was consciously awake. I could hear things. The voice was incessant, and it wouldn't stop at all. I couldn't stop hearing the voice of the little boy, and it just kept tormenting me. Every time I'd sleep in another room, I would never hear these voices or see anything. But the moment I stayed in that room, something was just off. There was another experience I had in that room, but I'm honestly not sure if it was sleep paralysis or just another experience. For whatever reason, I had the door open to my room, and this lady actually, just flew into my room. She had a dress on, and she was hovering above me. I say lady, and she had a white dress on, but in actuality, her face was completely blackened out, so I couldn't tell if she was actually a lady or not, but she had long hair and had feminine features. As the events started happening more frequently, my father had to carry me kicking and screaming to bed. This started happening at least twice a week. I became so afraid of the dark, and one time, when me and my father were walking down a dark hallway, something brushed against me. It scared me so bad that my dad found me curled into a ball on the floor. Then, things started happening around the house, like vases being broken or stains on the floor that no one ever saw. They always blamed me for everything, so naturally, everything was just put on me. I spent most of my childhood in trouble for things I never did, and the more trouble I was in, the more things would happen. Cupboards being slammed, doors being shut, the usual poltergeist activity. But it was all blamed on me. I was convinced the house was haunted, and that whatever was haunting the house didn't like me at all. Finally, I convinced my father to allow me to move in with my mother in the next town. For 2 weeks nothing happened, and I thought I had escaped it. But one night, my cousin spent the night, and it all started again. We were watching television, and suddenly, the power went out. It was storming really hard outside, and it sounded like someone hit something really hard against the front door. My cousin screamed. The lights and electricity flickered. She thought she saw someone staring at us through the living room window. She described the presence as the Hat Man, dark silhouette, only an outline. And when I went to see what she was screaming at, it was gone. Whatever this thing is, the boy, the woman in the white dress, and that Hat Man, it's all following me, even into college, and it terrifies the hell out of me. I just want this thing away from me, whatever it is. I'm not making this thing up. I don't even know why I would make my life more difficult than it needs to be, but I really want a resolution. Thanks for listening, and I hope I didn't frighten you too much. I've been reading the stories passed on by others, and thought I would share something that happened to me. But before I do, let me tell you a story my great-grandmother told me. My mother's mom died when she was 5 years old, so my great-grandmother raised her and her brothers and sisters. One day, as she was sewing in her bedroom, She said she felt someone come into the room. She looked up and saw her daughter, my mom's mother, standing at the doorway staring at her. Before my great-grandmother could do anything, the ghostly visitor said, "Where is the baby?" Shaken and thinking she was seeing things, she thought she would go wash some dishes and get her mind off what just happened. She had been washing dishes for about 5 minutes when she felt someone enter the room. She turned to see her daughter back again. As soon as their eyes met, her daughter once again said, "Where is the baby?" Thinking something went wrong and scared to death, my great-grandmother went to the backyard to check on the baby. When she got there, she found the yard empty and the gate opened. She went looking for my mother and saw her walking towards the busy street near their house. She was able to catch her just before she walked out into the street. Years later, I was home visiting my mother. As I walked past the front room towards the kitchen to see my mother, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a woman sitting in the front room. She had shoulder-length colored hair and was wearing a black dress. I thought it was my sister-in-law, so I went on into the kitchen. I talked to my mother for a few minutes, then asked why Tony was sitting in the front room, all by herself. My mother looked at me funny and told me that Tony was at work. I told her she was nuts and went to the front room to get her. When I got there, I found no one. Thinking she may have went upstairs, I searched for her and found nobody. I told Mom that I really did see someone sitting in there. She asked what she looked like. I told her, and she said, "Oh, that was my mother. Before she died, she told me she would always be near me." I don't know if I saw her mother or not, but I do know I saw someone, and then they were gone. I really did see them. I know I did. Mom has since told other stories of when Mother was around, but I'll have to pass those along another time. This story is as true as anything that I know of, and happened very recently. Tonight, to get technical, to give you a bit of background about my house, there's a hill to the right side of my house, which tends to give my friends a bit of a fright. I, on the other hand, have never been afraid of it. In fact, it has always intrigued me. My friend Emily and I had been sitting in the house and had gotten bored. I told her how my other friends had gotten scared of the hill, and we decided to go up and just goof off. At first, we were joking around and laughing. As we got closer to the top of the hill, we quieted down for some unknown reason. We were looking into the woods, which rest at the top of the hill, and I saw a white figure. At first I thought it was just light through the trees. Then I realized that no light could go through them, and that no light was that bright outside. I was wondering if it was my imagination, but I looked to my friend and saw the look on her face. She had seen it too. When we blinked, it seemed to fade, and if we talked about it, it seemed to make itself more known. I think its energy source was running low. It didn't seem to take the image of a person, but it did seem to bend over and shrink just to get bigger again. We weren't sure if we were just seeing things, so we went up 3 or 4 more times to verify what we saw, and that we did see something. Each and every time, it was still there, and it was white and glowing as ever. For this story, I must give you a bit of background also. My boyfriend had been telling me of an experience he had. He was walking through a graveyard, and he felt a presence, and an evil one at that. He didn't tell me much of what happened that night, and I never really wanted to know. But one night, we were on the phone, and he told me that I was there with him, and I asked him what? He said the ghost from the graveyard. He started to ignore it, and it took his breath away, literally. I could hear him gasping for air. Later on, he told me that it made his heart stop for a second. He swears that this is true. Finally, he decided to go back to the graveyard. I was still talking on the phone with him, trying to get him not to go. My friend Heather was here, and she wanted to use the phone to speak to him. We had pleaded to him that there was a dark energy there and to not go alone, and that whatever else was at the graveyard would follow him back home again. He wouldn't listen. He screamed at us through the phone, which was something that was very unusual for him to do. He was always quiet and calm, but on the phone, he was loud and angry. So, we ended up chasing after him to the cemetery. When we got to the cemetery, we didn't notice anyone there. We called him on the phone again. This time, no answer. Heather and I were terrified of what was going on. So we went back home, and we noticed that he was at the house, going up towards the hill. We screamed, "Josh, this isn't funny," and saw him go up to the top of the hill. When we finally caught up to him, he got on his knees and looked as though he was praying to something. What he was praying to, I have no idea, but he was praying. The moon was huge that night, and it was like he was in a trance. We couldn't get his attention, and then he passed out. I then shook him hard, and he finally woke up and was in tears. I asked him why he was doing this, and he said he didn't know. I truly believe that he was possessed, and whatever followed him the first time into the cemetery got inside of him. My favorite cousin was raised in a typical San Francisco townhouse. Typical in every way, except the haunting, I suppose. The ghostly occurrences happened to just about every member of the family that stayed there, so I'll give you some individual accounts. It began with the usual sighting, a shadow seen on several occasions, standing at the foot of the bed, yet it intensified with time. Eventually, the shadow manifested into a stronger image. How? Why did it gain power? Or did they become more open to that other plane of existence? My uncle was finally awakened, not just from the usual discomfort that accompanied the presence, but because he was being shaken violently by his legs from what appeared to be a heavy-set sailor who seemed not simply angry, but malevolent. Well, as if that incident hadn't already scared the heck out of Uncle Rami, the presence began manifesting in other intimidating ways. He would often come home from work earlier than everyone else, only to often see the same man glaring at him from the living room window. He must have been successful at ignoring the presence initially, for it resorted to another tactic which finally worked. Uncle Rami let himself in from work this last afternoon and headed back to shower and relax from his day. Once in the bathroom with the door closed behind him, a series of horrendous pounding began on the walls of the hallway, accompanied by the sound of angry stomping down the hall and towards the bathroom. His first instinct was to get out quick, only to find that the door would not open and seemed to be held tightly shut from outside. After about 15 minutes of the poundings and stompings, the house went quiet, and Rami took the opportunity to flee from the house. He sat in the driveway in his car for 2 hours until the rest of the family came home. Rama was only 5 when the family lived there, and this was the only time in his life that he had the problems that were so frequent in this house. He became a chronic sleepwalker and talker, so much so that you couldn't tell he was sleeping. Oftentimes, he was found in the living room talking to someone, or just whimpering with the front door open. He never remembered what he was dreaming, and of course, was always disconcerted when awakened and finding himself not in his own room. The scariest occurrence of this type took place in the middle of the afternoon. My aunt, my cousin Rochelle, and myself were in the kitchen making sandwiches. Rama was out playing in the living room. We were panicked by the sudden sound of his boyish voice, hitting the high pitch that hysteria causes as he screamed, "He's in there! He's in there! The bad man is in there!" My aunt dashed in to grab her son, despite the fact that obviously someone had broken in, only to find Rommel sitting straight up on the sofa in the otherwise empty, with front door locked room. She tried to shake him out of his hysterics, for he seemed wide awake, but it literally took a slap to the face to snap him out of it. No, she's not an abusive parent. Of course, he was calm upon awakening, with no recollection of the dream or remembrance of the hysterics. My cousin had a small dog during the time they lived in the townhouse, who of course was always barking at nothing. The walls, the hallway, the bedroom door. No wonder, considering what manifested to the people of the house. It died under highly unusual circumstances. The family had all gone out for the evening, and upon returning home, were surprised to not hear their pet yipping at their arrival. The doors and windows were all locked. Nothing was out of place, except that the dog was gone. They searched all the rooms, under beds, anywhere he might be within the house. Finally, my uncle chose to open the door to the basement to check it out too, only to find that the dog had somehow managed to open the basement door, put its leash on its collar, and wrap the leash around the banister in order to hang itself from the stairway. Obviously, the dog could not do any of these things, yet the house was entirely secured. I just figure it's lucky that the presence is so bent on scaring my relatives. To begin with, I live in Los Angeles, California, in the Valley. My house is a very unsettling place. Ever since I can remember, there have been unusual going-ons and oddities. The history of the house is this. The house was built in the late 50s in the Hollywood Hills, somewhere or other, I'm not quite sure. But it was eventually moved for some reason to the Valley in the early 60s, at which point my grandfather bought the house at an amazingly reasonable price for such a then luxurious and beautiful house. My family moved in, and they've lived there since. Now begins the second part of my story. When my grandfather was nearing the end of his life, he began to see things, namely my grandmother, whom he had divorced decades earlier, and who had died about 3 years earlier, and a small girl who he would become agitated at the sight of and wave away, saying things like "get away, you're gone," and the like. It was very unsettling, as I said. He, however, was not alone in his unusual experience in the house, as well as my aunt and father, who've also experienced oddities here as well. And nearly all of my friends who have stayed the night, and most significantly, me. My aunt has heard voices here when she was younger, and has seen a man out of the corner of her eye, standing at the corner of her bed, watching her. She also said that this caused her to have difficulty in breathing on occasion. My father is another story altogether, but I'm unsure as to his reliability, as he is quite frankly bipolar and schizophrenic. But several years ago, after my grandmother died in '64, he went quite insane and said that a thing in his room told him to hurt himself. I would otherwise discount this as part of his psychosis or mania, but after that happened, I came into the possession of the house as part of my inheritance from my grandfather, and when I first moved in, as there was hardly any furniture and I was staying there, I had to stay at his old room at the end of the hallway. There are no windows, and the only illumination is from a wall torchlight precisely in the middle of the hall, which will play in later oddities. When I lay down in there with my dog to rest a little bit on the mattress, which had previously been his, I felt decidedly unpleasant, as if I were being watched, but was suddenly so tired that I immediately fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, and my dog was huddled in the corner, whimpering and watching the ceiling in the diagonally opposite corner of the room, and seemed very frightened. The unpleasant feeling of being watched had greatly increased, and I left the room as hastily as I possibly could. When I had first moved in, about a week after the oddness with my dog, and before I could move over my bed from my previous residence, I'd moved over my father's bed from his old corner room and begun to sleep upon it. Things were fine for about a month or so, until one night, I awoke to see the silhouette of a tallish man standing in the doorway to my bathroom. There is a bathroom attached to my bedroom, and a door leading out from the bathroom into the entrance hall by the front door. The man was standing with his arms slightly bowed and head lowered with shoulders tense, and seemed angry for some reason, very angry. The man pointed at me, and I blinked, and he disappeared. What was even more disturbing about it was that the man appeared to be composed entirely of shadow, as if the brightest light possible were shining behind him, while the lighting behind him was just as it always is, as at that time, I usually left the entrance hall light on for anyone coming home late, and the light in my bathroom was on, which was directly flush with the man. Even more disturbing was that after I blinked, the man was gone, and when I looked to investigate, the door was once more closed, but the door was unlocked, which it never was, and the light in the bathroom was still on, which it also never was. I made a thorough search for my room, and it was completely sealed, and there was no possible way for what happened to have happened. About a day or two later, and this is the weirdest, most terrifying part, and the most horrific, I was laying in bed, the one my father had shot himself on after my grandmother had died, although he did not die of it. Hands began to form out of the mattress and massage my body. At first I thought it was a dream, as it was so absurd, but did not feel bad and was actually soothing, until the hands began to gouge and claw at me, trying to pull me into the bed, at which point I began to shriek and jumped out and off of the bed, and watched as the hands very silently melted, almost back into the mattress. My body hurt very much, and I went to observe myself in the full-length mirror, which my grandfather had hung upon the door between my room and my bathroom, which had been his. He was a short man though, so I don't believe the Shadow Man had anything to do with it, and I noticed that my entire body, from ankles to just below my neck, was covered in glass, as if I'd been scratched all over as well, and many were bleeding, although not profusely. I ran out of the room and did not sleep the rest of the evening, and in the morning removed both bed and frame and put them in the trash and on the curb. After this, I began to have nightmares in which a massive presence chased me through the rooms of places in which I had previously lived, or I would be in a normalish dream. I'm presuming that they were normal because I had never had a real dream, only nightmares, and then I would sense something approaching, even through the walls of the buildings in the dreams, and then it would appear and rush at me and attack by grabbing me by the neck and throttling me, and though it did not speak or even make sound or have form, I could see it as if it did, and it had the form of a large human-like thing. It could taunt me as if I could hear its thoughts. It strangled me and lifted my feet off of the ground and prevented me from calling out or even making sound, and I would struggle until I finally awoke. Many of the times I would awaken to find large handprints upon my neck, larger even than my hands. The worst of the strangulation dreams was one set in my back hallway. In the dream, I was walking about the house and heard something frying in the kitchen like eggs. And when I went in there, eggs were on the stove, and I felt such an inexplicable horror. After I went into the kitchen, I heard my dog whimpering in distress and ran to the sound and found her in the back hallway, and she was being held up by the throat and throttled as I had been before. I ran over shouting at the shadow thing and threw myself at it to force it to release my dog, and she was thrown back against the corner of the side hall, which leads to the other bathroom of the master bedroom, and laid unconscious, at which it began to throttle me until I managed to shout out God and was dropped, and awoke immediately to find my neck was severely sore and with bruising all over it. When I went to check on my dog, she was whimpering, and my mother could not figure out why she had suddenly began to whimper in the middle of the night. Thank you for listening to my story. I know it was kind of wild, but there are definitely shadow presences in this home, and they are really torturous. I hope nobody ever gets to experience what I experienced, but hey, it makes for a great story.
Being a kid from a large single-parent family, we moved around a lot. One of these homes was on 1864 Robinson. We were poor. My mom tried hard to give us the things we needed, but she had no help. My two younger brothers and I used to share a room and a bed together. We used to sleep upstairs in a large room, just opposite the bathroom on the south side of the house. It had a large window, with no curtains or coverings, so the streetlights used to shine through at night. At the end of the room was a closet that had no door. We rarely used it. One night, I was awakened by a large blue light coming from outside the room. I thought it was from the bathroom, but it was an intense blue and seemed to grow brighter and brighter. The door to our room was partly open, and all of a sudden, a young boy was standing in the doorway. He stood there, looking at me. I was frozen with fear. I tried to yell, but nothing came out. He was bathed in a blue light that, to this day, I have yet to experience again. He floated above the floor. He moved slowly towards me, gliding on air. He then floated along the wall, away from us to the closet. He stopped, turned, and floated in, the light disappearing. I couldn't move. I tried and tried. Finally, I slid off the bed and crawled to the stairs. I tried to walk down, but my legs gave way and I fell. My mom awoke and rushed to see what happened. She held me as I told her. She put me in her room and went and got my brothers. No one ever went in that room again. I used to go by there from time to time, until one day I went, and there now was a new home built there. Makes me wonder if anything strange ever happens to them. I have 3 stories to share. The first is an experience I had 20 years ago. My aunt, who lived with us, passed away. When she was alive, she would go out and get a snack around the same time every night. After her funeral, every night at about the same time, the refrigerator door would open and close. This went on for a couple of weeks, then stopped. Every so often, I still get a whiff of her perfume, as if she just walked past me. The second was experienced by both me and my daughter. She was very close to her grandfather her entire life. He passed away in 2000, shortly before the birth of her first child. Shortly after his passing, my daughter said in the middle of the night she would feel someone sit on the corner of her bed. When she would turn to look, no one was there. This was something her grandfather had done when she was little. After the baby was born, my daughter started noticing other strange things. The baby would turn her head, as if watching someone walking across the room, but no one was there. One night, she was holding the baby, and the baby was staring at what, to my daughter, was a blank wall and laughing. My daughter looked at the baby, and there was a reflection of the figure of a man, as if he were standing exactly where the baby was looking. Several times when I was babysitting at my daughter's house, the baby's musical toys would turn on by themselves, with no one close to them, and the baby would stare at that wall and laugh, as if someone was standing there. My daughter doesn't live in the house any longer, and the strange things seem to have stopped. The third is the strangest of all. My son and some of his friends went to an abandoned house that is supposedly haunted. The story is that a man killed his entire family in the house and then himself. There are bullet holes in the walls in the upstairs to support the story. Finding nothing of interest upstairs or on the main floor, they decided to investigate the basement. They found a partial wall at the end of the basement. They noticed a terrible odor coming from that area of the room. They looked over the top of the wall and found nothing but some old boots and a shovel. When they went back to go upstairs to the main floor, there was wet blood on the stairs. It had not been there on the way down. They nosed around on the main floor again and found some money tucked in a broken TV set. There was blood on the money too, but it was dried. Each person took a bill home with them. They all started to have extremely bad luck. Car accidents and such. They thought it might be connected to the money, so they took it back and placed it where they found it. The bad luck went away. They checked the basement again, but nothing was there. Others say you can drive past the house and see lights on in the windows, even though there are no working lights and there is no power to the house. Some say they've seen the figure of a child or a lady in one of the bedroom windows. My son and his friends have not been back since, and my son refuses to even drive past the house anymore. Growing up as a minister's daughter, I was very skeptical about ghosts all my life. Then I went to a small private college in Tennessee. My first year was pretty uneventful, but the second year I moved into a new dorm. My room was a suite of 2 rooms with a bathroom in between, and my former roommate lived in the other room. The first year in the suite there was only one occurrence of what I now think was a supernatural event. Normally, the doors between the 2 suites were kept shut. But one weekend, the girls on the other side of the suite asked my roommate and I to feed their hermit crabs while they went home. They had been gone for a day when my roommate and I came by to our dorm from lunch to find every single electrical appliance running, including the microwave, radio, and hair dryers. We had left the door to the adjoining suite open, but as we assumed it was just some silly called to prove it was there. It did. We had all been in the bedroom, and after our conference, we all went into the living area together. A huge stuffed bear that had been on its usual place on the floor when I had left the room earlier was now sprawled across the couch. Of course, we were pretty scared then. The pranks became worse. Wet towels no one had used would be on the bathroom floor. Breezes coming from nowhere would move the dust ruffles on the bed. Things would be taken out of drawers and left on the floor. On homecoming weekend, I was the only one who had stayed in town. I was in the suite alone, taking a shower, when I heard someone unlock and open the door to the living area and walk in. I heard high-heel shoes walk across the floor, through the bathroom, and through the other room and walk out the bedroom door. I thought at first that it was one of my roommates who decided to come home to homecoming after all, and I called out, "Hello?" But no one answered. The only other experience I have had is at the house in Vermont where Joe Walsh used to live. My husband's uncle is the caretaker there, and shortly after I met my husband, he took me up there to look at the house. I had not been told of any ghost stories connected to the house at this point. As we walked around the house, I became increasingly agitated. By the time we were upstairs, I was having trouble breathing. As we started toward the ballroom, I knew I had to get out fast. I was terrified and sensed just an overpowering feeling of evil there. I raced out, and I refused to even look at the house anymore. Later that day, my husband's uncle told me about all the different stories and encounters people have reported about the house. A man had hung himself in the very room that I had trouble breathing in. And at night, the uncle heard sound of people and objects moving frequently. I am now a true believer in ghosts, but I am also terrified of them, and I hope these are all the experiences that I will ever have.
My name is Kirk. I'm about to turn 18, and I live in New York State. I apologize in advance for the length of my story, but I never get to talk to anyone about these things that happen. I'm looking for answers as to whether or not the house I live in is haunted. I don't talk to my friends about them because I always get the weirdest reactions when I mention them. You know, the kind of look someone makes when they think you're insane. Since I was a little kid, I'd always found the paranormal amusing. My mom believes in ghosts based on her own experiences, which I might say are quite frightening. I have two older sisters, and both have related their own personal experiences to me. So, in a way, I suppose I was influenced into finding the supernatural interesting. I live in a two-family house that my family owns. We used to rent the bottom apartment out to people back in the late 80s to early 90s. The tenants have said that the downstairs apartment is haunted, and a psychic my mom brought over one time said that the apartment was indeed haunted. In one of the rooms downstairs, my great-grandfather passed away. The house has been in our family for a while. Also, my mom's nephew who came over from Ecuador was living with us when I was about 7 or 8. Hard to remember. He died while living here in a car accident in Lake George. Is it possible he has unfinished business because his wife and daughter live in another country? Also, my mom's boyfriend of a long time ago, this is back in Ecuador, which was probably in the 60s, died on a hiking trip. My mom loved him and always insists that he watches over her. That's just some background information, because they could all be possible haunts. The experiences I'm remembering are all recent ones. We moved from our old house in the early 90s and moved to Salem, Massachusetts. After 3 years, we moved back to our house in New York, and after that time, it's the only experiences I remember. My older sisters slept in our redone attic when they were teenagers. I was envious because they were on a whole different floor of the house. I used to think the attic was cool. Both my sisters have had stories about the attic. My sisters moved out long ago, which gave me the advantage of choosing a room up in the attic, being older and all. I chose the room which was my oldest sister's because of its size and location in the house. It was the last room and had stairs in the room going down and leading into the second floor apartment. The first night I slept up there, a good friend of 10 years stayed the night with me. He's the only one I talked to about my experiences with. It was about 2 a.m. and we were lying awake, starting to doze off. He had his Discman with him and was playing a CD with the headphones off of his head so we could both hear the music. I was lying there when all of a sudden I heard the distinct and startling noise of a marble rolling down the stairs that was in my room. It finally hit the bottom of the stairs, and I asked my friend if it was him that did that. I remember thinking, great, the first dang night I'm in here, and something weird has to happen. I definitely would have seen if my friend had thrown the marble down the stairs, but he didn't. By the way, this actually happened one more time before, not happening since. That story can probably be explained easily, but there are other weird ones. In the same room I was sleeping one night, I'm 95% sure I would have closed my closet all the way before I went to bed, because a thing like that would bother the hell out of me, and I wouldn't be able to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night to a very strange noise. It was a quick and harsh boom mixed with a whoosh sound. I looked around my room to find the source, and my eyes focused on my closet door. The door was open. I sort of stood up and chuckled because it was 3 a.m. I closed the door and went back to sleep. I later analyzed the sound because I remembered when I woke up. What it sounded like was the closet door being pushed hard from the inside and rubbing on the carpet as it opened, which would account for the whoosh. I was never scared, just sort of curious as to whether or not it was insane. The next experience was definitely an odd one. It was the morning. Morning is like 12 noon to me, especially in the summer. And I'd woken up and was getting ready to take a shower. I made my way downstairs and was heading to my mom's room to get a towel. No one else was in the house at this time. My mom was working, and so was her boyfriend. As I was passing through our dining room, I felt something cold hit my right earlobe. Within a couple seconds, my fingers were up to my ear to pinch whatever was on my ear, because I thought it was a bug. I took my fingers away and realized that what hit my ear was a drop of some liquid. It didn't feel like water. It almost felt like oil. It had a strange smell to it, almost like a perfume oil smell. Very confused, I rubbed it in my fingers and looked around the ceiling for the source. But if you think about it, an earlobe is an awkward place for something like that to land on. If it was coming from above, it would have hit the top of my ear, right? But that's not the end. I shrugged it off, got my towel, and went into the bathroom. I took my shirt off, and splot, I felt a drop hit my chest. Now this was weird, because I was totally in a different part of my house. And again, the chest is an odd place if the drop is falling from above. Before touching the spot, I looked at it. It definitely splattered with some force, because it was spread out a little. I touched it and smelled it, and it was the same dang substance. Why is this relevant? One night, I awoke to hear a very disturbing noise coming from the bathroom. Nobody was up at the time, and I heard a very distinct gurgling noise. I walked towards the bathroom to see what it was, when the lights turned on by themselves, and the shower curtain was moving. Remember, nobody was up, the lights were off, and they somehow managed to turn themselves on. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to inch closer to the shower curtain. I had to know if something was behind it. I moved the curtain, and to my relief, there was nobody there. But then the lights turn off once again. I start to get really freaked out and rush to turn on the light. I look across the hallway, and I see what looks like an elderly man in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask on his face. He looked about as real as any living person would. Now, it wasn't like I saw this figure for a long time. I wasn't on meds, and I'm a sober person. I wouldn't even say I was tired. The encounter lasted about 10 to 15 seconds. It was fast, but it was long enough that I could see this man. I honestly felt like the liquid that I felt came from this gurgly elderly man. I found that very interesting, and later, I told my mom about it. She thought I was joking and laughed it off, then grew very concerned after I insisted that this was something I saw. She thought I was having hallucinations and wanted to take me to the doctor, but I urged her that I was of sound mind. Although she did later tell me that something similar happened to her, where she could have sworn she felt the presence of an elderly man, but she never saw anything. Lastly, there was an unexplained experience that happened in my room. One of my cats was sleeping on my bed, and I was sitting in this love seat I have, watching TV. My lights were off, so I couldn't see anything clearly other than the TV. Something startled me when I heard something hit my wall, as if being thrown, like a hammer hitting a wall. I then started to notice that my cat uncharacteristically started hissing at the window and moaning. She's usually a very quiet cat, but something really seemed to bother her, and she wouldn't keep quiet. She kept meowing for what seemed like 5 minutes. I didn't see anything in the window, and the cat for the next week persisted to meow in terror before she just gave up. She never did that ever again, and it was quite bizarre. It really started to scare me. On a separate day, I've heard cabinets opening and shutting. These things terrify me because I still have no explanation for them. Is my house haunted by a timid spirit who wants to know that it's there? Any comments or advice would be appreciated. Hope you found my story interesting. During the summer of 1976, my mom, older brother, and I decided to accompany my aunt and her family to West Virginia and North Carolina to work in the tobacco fields. I was about 11 years old at the time. After a 2-day trip from Texas to West Virginia, we were assigned a house to stay in while we were settled into work. There were several of us, 10 in all, and we were tired from the trip, so everyone just basically picked a spot in a place and readied ourselves for bed for that first night. It was not a restful night. At about 3 a.m., we were awakened by the sounds of a woman crying and wailing in the room with us. Looking around the room, we could see that everyone was accounted for and no one was crying. The sounds increased in intensity and lasted for about 10 minutes. When I say wailing, I mean just that, a horrible, low sound, very similar to some of the sound effects heard in the old Scooby-Doo cartoons. I realize that sounds somewhat funny, but I swear it's true. I'm not sure if my eyes were just playing tricks on me, but in the darkness of the room, It really looked like there was a figure kneeling down. You could see it well enough in the dark to know that it was a gray outline of some figure. Interestingly enough, after the 10 minutes of sobbing, I noticed that this gray cloud ended up disappearing as well. Thankfully, we weren't to stay in that house for very long. Another house, with more room for 10 people, was assigned to us. That was not an improvement. The next house was a 2-story one, located somewhere between Hendersonville, North Carolina, in a small town known as Soul City. It was situated about 200 yards off a road, with a long driveway and a set of railroad tracks that ran along the other side of the road. There was a large white house off to the north of our house, about another 300 yards away. The house had a large open field in front and was surrounded by woods on the other 3 sides, and a shed and an old open water well in back. Spooky enough setting during the day. At night, things would happen, such as lights turning on by themselves, footsteps heard upstairs, when everyone was in plain sight downstairs, the sounds of something heavy being all dragged through the house late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, knocking on the walls, and my brother swears he's seen what appeared to be a black hooded figure at the foot of his bed. I remember I had my window open once while asleep at night, and I could have sworn I heard the sounds of a horse running across the field outside. Nobody in our area owns any horses at all, and you could hear the sounds of neighs. I ended up looking outside and saw absolutely nothing, but there was definitely a horse that I heard. I swear to anyone reading this, these events really happened. I know people often make claims like that, which make it seem like it's fabricated, but I really want to put an emphasis on the validity of these stories. All I have is my word, but I'm telling you, these events are so real. I'm 36 now, an Army veteran, college educated, and I have an interest in ghosts and the supernatural. If anyone has any clues about the house, the one near Soul City, North Carolina, its owners, or perhaps even its history, please email me. When I was in 8th grade, my mother, younger brother, and I moved into a rental home on Grace Drive in Wilson, North Carolina. I'd always been interested in ghosts, but never had any experience. This house would change that fact. As soon as we moved into the home, I had a very uneasy feeling, only in my room. I always felt like someone was watching me from my closet. Also, feeling uneasy, I could not sleep with my door closed and forbid my mother to close her door while we were sleeping. I also started sleeping with my pillow on top of my head in order to feel safe and secure in this room. On several occasions, I felt someone pushing the pillow down hard on my head as I was trying to go to sleep. It was not sleep paralysis because I had just laid down. At first I thought it was my brother playing with me, to the point where I yelled out his name for him to stop because the pushing hurt. However, when the pushing stopped, no one was in the room, and I was all alone. One evening around dusk, my mother and I were sitting on the front steps that were located between the bedroom end of the home and the living room, where my brother was alone watching TV. My bedroom was located on the front of the house, with only one window. I had a lamp sitting on my bedstand, in front of the window, and beside the bed. I stood up in order to illustrate a point to my mother, now facing the house with my bedroom window in sight. All of a sudden, I saw movement in my window. It was a shadow in the act of sitting on my bed. Once it sat down, the shadow seemed to fade into the shadows of my bedroom. I stood there looking at my window and said to my mother that my brother was in my room and that he needs to get out. I immediately went into the house to find my brother still watching TV. I asked him what he was doing in my room, and he just stared at me like I was crazy, saying that he had not left the living room. Of course, I went to my room to find no one there. We lived in the house for about 2 years, and only when we moved into our new house was I able to sleep with my door closed, with my mother's door closed. However, this new house was where my mother saw her first ghost. This happened about 2 months after we moved into the house. She said that she was laying in bed one night, unable to sleep because the streetlights in the city were so bright. She said that she looked over to her window and saw an old man standing in her room in front of the window. The old man walked over to the bed and looked down at her and then backed away, only to disappear. She smartly did not tell me the story until I'd been away at college for 3 years. We are assuming that the old man was Mr. Barnes, who we think may have died in the house and was just checking in on the new occupants. That was the first and last incident that occurred in that home. I'm 16 years old and live in a small town in Texas. It's about 28 miles south of San Antonio. When I was in 3rd grade, my family decided to move down here from Corpus. We began living with my grandfather and soon decided to buy property of our own. My mom and dad bought the property located right next to my grandfather's, which just happened to be the entrance to a coal mine that was very active about the 1900s. We built our house right next to the entrance to the coal mine. Our back door opened right on top of the entrance. By the time the house was built, I was about 13 and finally had my own room. One night, I was struggling to sleep and heard footsteps. Of course I was frightened, but somehow I went to sleep. I kept telling myself it was nothing. While I was sleeping, and this part of the story doesn't make sense at all, I had a dream that I was part of a well-known Jewish family in Europe in the Great World Conflict. I saw soldiers take my husband and I to a ditch in the middle of nowhere, where they got rid of my husband. In my dream, I understood German. Next, they got rid of me also. As I died in my dream, I woke up in real life. As I awoke, I heard more footsteps marching. They sounded like soldiers, Germans I assumed. They marched through my kitchen and some by my bedroom door, kinda like they were watching me. This is the first thing that happened to me. It didn't make sense, because I thought they would be dead miners or something. About 2 years ago, I became very depressed, as many young people do, and I tried to off myself. My mother came home from work and found me passed out and throwing up in the kitchen sink. They rushed me to the nearest hospital, where they thought I was going to pass away. I saw my mom crying next to me and became relaxed. I was in total peace. I felt completely happy. Suddenly, I felt 2 men walking around me talking. I tried to turn my head to see them, but couldn't. I heard them speaking to each other, and one sounded older than the other. They said, "Look, it's so sad she's so young." And the other one said, "Look at her mother." At this point, they quit talking and continued to walk around us staring. Then, the feeling of peace was gone, and I heard 2 other voices. I kept saying, "Who is that?" And I was scaring my mom to death. Right after that, I passed out, and when I woke up, I was in a hospital room. I didn't tell anyone exactly what it was I heard. I did tell my boyfriend of the time. I'm not sure he believed me. After that, I would hear voices at my house, people talking to me, but there was no one there. I heard them almost everywhere I went, but I didn't tell anyone. After a while, I tried talking back, but never got a response. The voices were never really clear. There were many at one time. It just sounded mumbled. I tried not to tell people about my voices because I was afraid they would not talk to me anymore. I felt I had a gift. They have stopped talking now. I haven't heard them for about a year now. I know it all sounds weird, but it's true. I also live next to a graveyard, which is weird, I know. It's where most of the dead miners are buried. I think they try to talk to me sometimes. There is also one last account I had more recently. I was trying to go to sleep one night in the house all by myself. I looked out into the living room and saw a solid black figure running around. He looked as if he were hiding. He ran behind furniture and walls and really just scared the heck out of me. It was the only time I saw him though. It was the last of all my encounters.
First of all, let me explain. I'm from England. I'm a 26-year-old male living in Cambridge. I was born in Yorkshire, North England. Just up the road from where I lived was a place called Oakwell Hall, located in an area called Birkinshaw. Oakwell Hall is a fairly small house compared to some in the UK, but it certainly has local character. Many a day away from school would be spent wandering around the grounds. Local legend has it that the hall was once inhabited by a great local family named the Bats, hence the local town of Batley, and that one of the sons of the family, a womanizer and gambler of no small repute, found himself in a duel fought on the local moors. The servants all knew of this, and so were relieved. The sounds of his horse were heard, re-entering the stables. They were even more relieved when the son was seen walking through the hall, up the stairs, and to his bedchamber. They then made a rather spooky discovery when they noticed a bloody footprint on the staircase. Thinking their master was injured in the duel, they entered his chambers to see if they could help him. He was not there. The bed had not been disturbed. There was no horse in the stable. News was later conveyed that the son had died in the duel, and every Christmas Eve, the same bloody footprint can be seen on the staircase. This is not what I saw. I was 8 years old, and it was the school holidays. Two friends, Stephen and Stuart and myself, were walking through the garden when Stuart noticed one of the windows was blacked out. We noticed it as the sun was behind the house and so should have been shining pretty much through the hall and out the other side. Thinking that there may be something going on, there are occasionally demonstrations in the hall. We entered the building and up the stairs. As we got to the top of the stairs, Stephen remarked he felt a bit funny, and I suddenly felt cold. The next thing we saw was a black blob about a half a meter off the floor and about 1.5 meters tall float out of one door and into another. Stuart asked if anyone else had seen it, and we all said we had. Stuart then started to walk down the corridor very slowly, while Stephen and I stayed at the top of the stairs and were quite scared. Stuart looked around the corner and then ran back to us. We were so scared at this point that we just ran out and down the drive to the gate. Stuart told me later that he saw a figure about 6 foot tall that seemed to be made of shadows. He was dressed in a long coat and wore what looked like a top hat. He seemed to be looking for something, and then I became aware of him. He told me much later, about 10 years later, that it looked over its shoulder at him, and rather than a pair of eyes, it had a single red slit that seemed to pulse. I've been back to the hall since, and seen nothing out of the ordinary. However, I felt very uneasy about certain rooms. Oh well, there you go. I don't know if this qualifies as having a haunting or possession, or if I'm just crazy. I've read several stories on your site, which is great by the way, and haven't come across anything similar to one of my experiences, which I'll tell below. My father is suffering from advanced rheumatoid arthritis, along with hepatitis C. Not a good combination. Anyway, I've been living with the pain of knowing he would be sick and in pain for the rest of his life since I was 16. I'm now 22, and watching him suffer and struggle with his diseases. Because of this, I've become increasingly interested in whether or not there is another phase of existence after we leave this world. I've been asking, both mentally and out loud, for some type of proof of this, mostly for my own comfort. Anyway, I've recently been hearing noises that sound like a lot of people talking at once in my house when I'm home alone. It doesn't bother me or scare me, and it's so faint that it could be my imagination. Along with this, I've heard walking on my ceiling. My rooms are in the finished basement. In thinking my fiancé was home, went upstairs to greet him, only to find myself still alone in this very house. Since I've been asking for proof, I wonder if it's only my imagination, but this next part was scary. I heard the voices. Sounds like a crowd of people all talking at once, but this time, I wasn't hearing them externally, with my ears, but originating from inside my head. I had this weird feeling that they were all talking directly to me, rather than just overhearing things like the other occasions. Anyway, the voices in my head just kept getting louder and louder, and all of a sudden, I was laughing uncontrollably for no reason. Probably doesn't sound too scary to you, but the whole time I was laughing, about 5 minutes, I was having thoughts like, why am I laughing? Why can't I stop laughing? There's nothing funny about this, and such. I was scared and physically willed myself to stop laughing, which didn't work. The voices started fading after about 5 minutes, and my laughing reduced to giggles, and then to shocked silence. I've never told anyone about these things. I even think I sound crazy. And no, I was not on any mind-altering substances at the time this happened. Has the voices, laughing thing happened to anyone else out there? Or am I just crazy? If this has happened to someone out there, please email me. Okay, I know there are skeptics out there, but my grandmother, my mom, and I are very in tune with our spirits for some reason. I'll start with my grandparents' babysitting ghost. We call him that because only kids could see him if all adults were out of the house. To explain the house a bit, the hallway is L-shaped. There's a bathroom to your immediate right, then 2 bedrooms, bedrooms 1 and 2, on your left. When you turn the corner, there's a bedroom, number 3 on your left, another bathroom on your right, and the last bedroom, number 4, at the end of the hall. My mom's dad was at work, and her mom and all my mom's brothers and sisters were outside, talking to friends and such. My mom was just sitting and watching TV. As my mom was watching TV, she saw something moving out of the corner of her eye and looked down the hallway from the living room. There was a very tiny old man sitting in a rocking chair, reading a book and looking up at her from time to time. She said he just smiled at her and kept rocking and reading. When the adults came back into the house, he disappeared. Two of my cousins have seen him also. The one thing that totally freaked us out was after my mom and I moved in with my grandparents. My Uncle Kay had died in the first bedroom about a year before. He was really into drinking and drugs, so one night his heart, liver, and kidneys just failed on him. He was the practical joker of the family. Anyhow, my mom and I came home one night. My grandparents were out. We both had to use the bathroom really bad, so my mom ran to the first one, and I went to the second one at the end of the hallway. All of a sudden, I heard my mom yell, "Hey!" I was about to open the door to ask why she was yelling, when I saw a hand open the bathroom door. I hurried up and finished my business and ran to my mom and asked her what happened. Why did she open the door to the bathroom and not tell me what she needed? Then I realized she was still in the bathroom. She said she saw a hand opening her bathroom door. I told her I saw the same thing. We're the only people in this house, and this happened on the opposite ends of the house. She just looked up at the ceiling and said, "Kay, stop scaring us. We don't want to play with you right now. Your jokes aren't funny." We heard the most evil laugh we could imagine. At that point, we looked at each other and ran out of the house. When we came back, my grandparents were home, and we sat my grandma down and told her what happened. She had to have the house blessed 3 times before the spirits went away. I was visiting some relatives in Denton, Texas, in early July of this year when this strange event took place. My relatives live in a trailer park, and some of the trailers are sitting close together. One late night, when I was there, my nephew left his cigarettes in his car, so he went out to get them. I went with him. As we were walking to his car, we noticed that next door, there was someone rummaging around in a trash can that was in the back of the neighbor's truck. We thought nothing of it, thinking it was just one of the neighbors looking for something they threw away. As it was dark near where the vehicles were parked, we couldn't make out who it was. Well, my nephew got his cigarettes out of his car, and we were walking to the front of his trailer, where there is a bench you can sit on. We were walking towards it, when we noticed whoever it was that was walking through the garbage can was now walking up to the next door neighbor's porch, which was a good 20 to 30 feet from us. For whatever reason, just the sight of the person made both of us freeze, while this figure just stood at the foot of the next door neighbor's porch steps with its back to us. It was almost as if this figure knew we were looking at it, but it wasn't even facing towards us. It just stood there, and we felt that somehow it was looking at us. Somehow. In the light of the porch lights, we could make out the details of this figure. The figure was of a small boy, but what was weird was that his head was shaven on both sides of his head, and in the middle was a blonde Mohawk type haircut, except it wasn't the short type, but more of the longer hairstyle Mohawk. This kid had 80s style clothes on. The short, multicolored and unbuttoned, light blue shorts and white tennis shoes. This kid just stood there for a few moments and began ascending the next door neighbor's steps in a stiff, awkward way. Its arms were close to its sides, and as it went up the steps, it just continued staring straight ahead, not once looking down or in any other direction. Then, the view of the kid was obstructed by the neighbor's porch, so we could no longer see him. The weird thing is, we never heard the next door neighbor's front door open or anything that would indicate this person went in. My nephew and I, very unnerved and chilled, ran into his parents' trailer. We sat in his living room for a while, trying to rationalize what we had seen. He told me that the neighbors had two girls, but looked nothing like what we had seen. We asked my nephew's mother, my sister, if she knew if the neighbors had some relatives over, and if so, if they had a boy that looked like what we described. She said, not that she knew of. Well, the next day, we go over to the neighbor's trailer and ask them if they had anyone over that looked like what we saw. They said no. We've had no visitors in 2 weeks, and no, we have no boys or children like what you described. My nephew and I then noticed there were two girls in the living room. We confirmed that that was the only children they had. So, who or what could have been? Where did it go? We didn't hear it go in the neighbor's home that night, so maybe it was just a strange neighborhood kid and went through their backyard to where they were going. Well, that would have been very difficult, since the neighbors have one of those extremely high wooden fences with no doors on it in their backyard. Besides, why would it go through the trouble of going up into their porch when they could have gone around? It's an old trailer park, and there's no telling how many people have lived and died in a lot of those trailers. I'm just glad I don't live there. Something and everything about this is strange, and what we saw that night, I know in my heart that it was not normal, but paranormal. I'm just glad the figure never turned around to look at us. I don't know what would have happened then. I'd hate to find out. My name is Paul, and I live in Canada, in the province of Nova Scotia, in a small city called Sydney. This small city was at one time an industrial center with coal mines and a large steel plant that employed thousands. This area's past employment promises has drawn in many foreigners to settle here, and we have a rich history of superstitions and beliefs. I should say that I'm not exactly a believer in ghosts, although I have an open mind to the idea that there may be something to it at all. Anyway, on with my story. I think I was 17 or 18 when this happened, which was around 1987. I was working for my local McDonald's restaurant and was working until 2 a.m. It was shortly after midnight when I took a break and called my girlfriend to say goodnight. As we talked, she stopped to see if someone had come down the stairs from the second level of her parents' home because she thought she had heard footsteps. She checked the stairs twice, but nobody was there. The conversation turned to the fact that at times, she would hear sounds in the house as though someone was walking the stairs. Our topic then returned to the normal teenage babble until she happened to look into the adjacent room. She thought she saw someone sitting at the end of the sofa. She put the phone down momentarily while she turned on the light in the darkened room. It was only a sweater and a jacket laid over the backrest of the sofa, so we resumed our conversation once again. I can tell you that she had no thoughts of anything paranormal. She was thinking that maybe someone else was home, other than her sleeping parents, as she had a number of older brothers still living at home. I can remember that as we talked, she stopped dead in mid-sentence and started to weep. I was wondering what was wrong, thinking that I had said something to upset her. When I got her to speak, she told me that there was someone there, standing in the doorway of the room where she had just been. She sobbed that she was trying to sit very still in the hopes that this apparition would not see her and just go away. I tried to talk to her and settle her down, not quite sure if this was a joke or not. I think that the figure stood in this position for at least 5 minutes. Then, just when my terrified girlfriend calmed down a little, The figure moved into the hallway and assumed a sitting position, legs crossed. I again had to try and calm her down by talking to her and asking her to describe what she was seeing. The figure, she said, appeared to be a boy of about 8 or 10 years old. He was wearing a modern-looking winter jacket and a winter hat. She said that although the facial features were not plain, the eyes could be clearly seen and were blue. The hands and feet area of the figure faded out of sight. This boy sat on the floor, not 10 feet from her, and looked right at her. Another minute or two passed, and then my girlfriend started weeping again. I remember her whispering, "Oh, Paul, it's a girl." She told me that the figure had reached up and pulled a hat off its head, and long blonde hair flowed from under it. The figure sat and stared in my girlfriend's direction a few minutes more, and then appeared to stand up and go back into the room where it came and disappeared. My girlfriend stayed on the phone just long enough to be sure it was gone. Then she hung up with me and ran for her parents' bedroom. That was the end of the experience, and had lasted about 15 minutes. She asked her parents the next day if they could think of who this may have been. They had no ideas and probably didn't believe her. I wasn't quite sure if I believed her either, and I kept asking her if she was playing a joke on me. She insisted she saw what she saw, and she wasn't comfortable talking about it for fear that it may reappear. I'm now married to my girlfriend, and she still swears every word of this is true. She still doesn't like to talk about it. No one has ever seen a ghost in that house before, or since, that I'm aware of. My wife over the years has gotten spooked, and came running to me saying that she felt uneasy, and was afraid she was back, but she hasn't been. I don't know if you respond to these letters or not, but if you do, write me a note to tell me what you think. Thank you for reading. While I was working at a hospital in town, I had the opportunity to come in contact with many ghosts. I worked on the geriatric floor, and elderly people died there every day. If the power suddenly went out and immediately came back on, a person had just died. This happened every time. One of the most notable apparitions that I've personally seen was a man with a cane that is seen wandering the halls at night. People admitted to the hospital would often report tapping sounds and seeing an old man's face grinning at them from the hospital door, which all of them had. One lady of about 80 kept telling me that she saw this man's face in the mirror in the bathroom, and that half of his face would look badly beaten and disfigured. There have been reports of a cloaked man praying over the dead bodies of the recently departed. I can remember one incident where I walked into the morgue and I saw a body that was recently pronounced dead and covered. I could have sworn that I saw the fading presence of this monk kneeling over the body for a few seconds, then disappear. I would feel the air in the room be so cold, but after he vanished, it warmed up. Another popular ghost at the hospital was the Grim Reaper. The Reaper was a dark figure that would come through the window at the end of the hallway. He would shut doors, touch you on the shoulder, etc. Late at night, you could feel that someone was there, and you would see a dark figure out of the corner of your eye. As soon as you looked up, he was gone. My favorite story to tell is this. I was helping a woman get her bath early one morning. I was asking her how she slept, how she felt, etc. She told me that she did not get a wink of sleep because of the man's face she saw in the window. She said that she thought it was tree branches, but she got up in the middle of the night and saw that it was a man's face staring at her through the window. This woman was just in the hospital for a kidney infection, she wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. On third shift, you could hear children giggling and hear them running up and down the halls, but there are no children on the floor. If you went past the operating room at night, it would be locked, but inside, you could hear instruments clanging and things being thrown around. Haunted church stories seem to be popping up frequently lately, and I'm here to say that I have a brief story that will involve just that. There's this Catholic church that I used to constantly clean. This was in Vermont, and the church had to have been built in the late part of the 19th century. Very beautiful windows, looked immaculate. Anyway, I used to work as a janitor cleaning the halls late at night, when I would be the only one there. There were many times when I would hear the organ notes playing repeatedly. I would hear the echoes of human voices speaking together, like whispers, and sometimes even clear words. One night, I was cleaning around the church once again. I was all the way at the end of the church when I heard the organs going off. It wasn't the usual sound either. It sounded monstrous, as if someone was literally stomping on the organs. I looked immediately in the direction of where the organ sounds were coming from, and I could have sworn I saw a cloaked figure at the organ and playing it. It was the typical transparent looking apparition, and when I walked even closer to get a better look, the figure had seemed to disappear. That was, of course, the worst of what I had witnessed, but there were times where I would see the organ once again playing by itself. I'd see a note or two being pushed down by itself when nobody else was in the room, and it was quiet. Anyway, that's all I have to report. I don't work at this church anymore, I'm happy to say, but I thought it was worth sharing. I wish I could say that this wasn't a real experience, but unfortunately, I can't. At least this will always make for an entertaining read. My name is Shannon. I'll be 18 in 11 days. I live in Georgia, and I'm writing to you because I feel so alone. For as long as I can remember, I've dealt with ghosts. I don't know what they are or what they want from me, but they seem to follow me. For the first 5 years of my life, I lived in a trailer in Mississippi. I can only recall one incident from them because I was so young. I remember it was a beautiful day in spring, and I was sitting on a picnic table in our backyard, making mud pies, when suddenly I heard what I thought to be my mother's voice calling me from the woods. I started to follow it. The closer I got, the further out into the deep woods the voice seemed to go. I almost followed it all the way into the woods, thinking my mother was calling me, but suddenly I heard my mother's real voice calling me from the trailer. I turned and saw her waiting for me next to the picnic table, so I ran back and told her what had happened. She, of course, said that it was my imagination. About 12 years ago, our family moved here to Hiram. Every single night for years, I was terrified to sleep because I saw shadow people. They were like three-dimensional shadows that looked like people. I saw them in my room at night after my parents would put me to bed. When I'd call my parents into the room, they would turn on a light and the shadow people would be gone. They said it was my imagination. Lots of other things have happened, and there have been witnesses to some of the events. The house will shake at times. The doors will open and close on their own. I've seen dolls move on their own. A glass has exploded in my hand for no reason. I know glasses will explode from temperature changes, but there was no change in temperature at all. There was a music box that music would play in other rooms of the house when the music box wasn't around. I've heard footsteps when no one was home or awake. I've heard voices. The list goes on. I thought maybe that there was something wrong with me, so I went to a psychiatrist. She said that there's nothing wrong with me. I've learned to verify that I'm really hearing something, because even my cats notice something and hear a lot of things. If they hear it too, their ears perk up. I've tried talking about it before, and they either don't believe me and think I'm making it up, or they think I'm crazy. I really feel alone, and it would be nice if you could give me some sort of guidance. What should I do? Should I do anything? Well, I apologize for the long email. I'm sure that you get a lot of mail every day, and I hate to add to the pile. Thank you for your time. My name is Luann. I'm 19 years old and live in a little redneck town in Virginia. I live with my grandparents and have lived all my life. My mom was 14 and in the 8th grade. My mom had a very best friend named Wendy, who was 13. They did everything together. Soon after our house was built, Wendy's parents were not getting along and were going through some separation and divorce procedures. Wendy and her mother had moved to Woodbridge, Virginia, soon. During the time of the separation, Wendy spent a great deal at my mom's newly built house. They spent much of their time in my mom's room, which is now my room. Then came the time for Wendy and her mom to move. It was very early one morning. Wendy was in the back of the van, holding a glass coffee table steady. This was in the days before seatbelt laws. There was a drunk driver on the road and hit the van head on. Everyone made it out with semi-serious or minor injuries, but not Wendy. The corner of the glass coffee table hit her in the head and killed her instantly. Years later, in 1985, a week before my mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was in the family room talking to my grandparents about going on birth control. My grandmother and my uncle both caught a glimpse of a girl standing behind my mother, and after that 2-second glimpse, she was gone. My uncle and grandmother agreed that it looked like Wendy. Oh, and she was actually shaking her head when she appeared. We believe that she was shaking her head because she knew my mom was pregnant and didn't want her to go on birth control. Ever since then, everyone in my family has caught a glimpse of her in our house. I usually never get any negative feelings when she materializes, but there was one moment I witnessed her ghost that completely terrified me. I was in the shower, I was home alone, and I had the door completely wide open. It was late evening, and I heard the door to the bathroom slam shut. It startled me so much, so I got dressed and headed out the door. I could have sworn I heard my name being called in a gentle, quiet whisper. It sounded like a little girl. I go downstairs and walk into the living room, and then I see the lights flickering. I also start to hear the sounds of footsteps walking across our hardwood floors. At this point, I thought I had an intruder in the house. I go to call the police, and after I hang up, I rush upstairs to hide in my bedroom. The thing was, as I was running upstairs, I could have sworn I saw the presence of a little girl, in black, in the corner of my eye as I ran for the stairs. It was only for a couple seconds, and of course, my mind was just thinking about hiding from this intruder. I could have just been seeing things, but I swear, I saw a girl for a second. The police showed up, of course, couldn't find anyone, and all was quiet. My parents came home, and I told them what happened. They were just happy that I was safe. It wasn't until a few days later that I realized it could have been Wendy. Because my room used to be my mom's room, She's in my room most of the time. I feel her presence there a lot. When I'm upset, no matter where I am in the house, I can feel her there. No one has seen her until my mom became pregnant. My family believes that she was sent to watch over her best friend's daughter. This happened to my cousin and I in Lato too, in a ranch-style house my family and I used to live in. My cousin woke up in the middle of the night to my voice, or so she thought it was my voice. She looked at me, and I was sound asleep and not talking. Also that night, it was probably 4 or 5 in the morning, and I felt someone pecking on my knee, and it wasn't my cousin because she was sound asleep, so I just thought it was my imagination. As we were eating that morning, my cousin had told me what she had heard. I freaked because I knew that whatever had pecked me on my knee was not my imagination. Nothing was ever actually seen in this house, but a lot of things were felt and heard. A few months after that incident, my cousin was staying the night again. Everyone in the house had been asleep for 2 or 3 hours, but my cousin, she was so addicted to the game The Sims, and she was still on the computer. As she was shutting down the computer, she heard voices coming from the hallway directly to her right. She looked down there and saw nothing. The voices she heard, she knew were not any of ours, so she ran to the floor where she had made her bed and covered her head up. I guess the voices must have stopped after that. A lot of times I would hear cabinets shut, dishes clank together, and other odd unexplainable noises. One night, my brother got home from a friend's house around 1 or 2 in the morning. I'd been asleep on the couch in the living room for at least 4 hours, and my parents had been asleep in their room for about the same amount of time. As my brother got out of his car, he looked towards the door that went directly into the living room from the outside. It had a little window on it. He could see the light from the TV that I always left on at night, but he also saw a black figure looking at him from the inside. He ran in the house and noticed I was on the couch sound asleep. Then he went into my parents' room and asked if they'd been up, and they hadn't. What is scary is that the thing was in the same room with me. The next night, I slept on the couch again. Do not ask me why. My brother was not home yet, and my parents had went to bed. I was watching TV, and I got kind of uneasy, so I laid down and covered up my head. After a while, I heard the glasses in the kitchen sink clanking together. I started to sweat. Then I felt as if someone was coming into the living room, where I was. When my brother arrives home, and the noises stop, I got up and looked at the dishes in the sink, and none of them had been moved. About 14 years ago, we moved into a house that was built in the 1950s. I believe that used to be a boarding house and was right in front of a cemetery. There were lots of noises heard there, and a few spirits as well. I remember staying home one day from school, and my mom was asleep because she worked nights, and I heard a voice say my name. It scared me because we were the only ones home, and it was a voice I had never heard before. My mom would be home during the day by herself, while my brother and I were at school, and she would hear a music box playing. At the time, we had music boxes, but they did not play the song she heard. My mom would be sleeping on the couch, and she would hear footsteps coming through the kitchen, which was right next to the living room where she was. One time, when that happened, she grabbed her shoes and didn't come back till we got out of school. She also would be sleeping in her bed, and it would start shaking. This also happened to me. The shed in this house was directly behind my parents' bedroom, because their bedroom used to be a garage. Well, anyway, my mom would be lying on her bed, and she would hear someone or something walking in there. The odd thing was, it sounded like boots on wood, but the floor in there was concrete. We had a little dog out there at the time, but there was no way it could have sounded like that when it walked. One night, my mom, dad, and brother, we were all sleeping in my room because we put the air conditioner in there in the summer. Well, anyway, it was a cool night, so they had turned the air off and left the door open. My mom, for some reason, looked at the doorway and felt as if there was a presence there. She just put her face into my dad's back and went to sleep. The next day, she found out that her beloved dad had died, who lived in Kansas, and hadn't been found for a few days. She believes that it was him in the doorway. My brother saw a ghostly head in his bathroom one night. It was in a mist. It was bald on top, with hair around the edges of his head. We believe it was my great-grandpa. This happened at my grandma's house on September 2nd, 2004. It was my grandma's birthday and my mom, my little cousin, and I went there to have cake and ice cream. Well, my little cousin decides she wants a Miracle Whip sandwich. She pressed up against the door frame, asking my grandma if she could have a sandwich, when all of a sudden, she looked towards the microwave in the kitchen and screams, drops the jar, and runs to the couch where my grandma is, and my little is crying hysterically. We were all like, what just happened? For some reason, I became very cold and got goosebumps and had the urge to sit up. My little cousin wouldn't tell us what she saw. My grandma tried to tell us it was a mouse or a bug, but I highly doubt it, because she wouldn't have acted like she did. My grandma believes in ghosts, but I think she said that to make herself feel better, because she knew she was going to be there alone when we left. My little cousin, I believe, has forgotten about the incident, so I did not know what happened. Other things have happened at the grandma's, like something kicked her bed very hardly one night, and she also seen the spirit of a young girl dressed in white one day while lying on her couch in her living room. She's seen a shadow-like figure outside her window, which she knows wasn't a human because her cat started hissing and acting weird, and there's probably been other things that happened that I do not know about. I don't believe I've actually ever seen a spirit, but I know I felt them because in certain places, or sometimes when I talk about the spirits, the back of my neck starts to hurt and feels weird, and sometimes my head will start hurting. I have so many stories to share with you, but I will send them at a later time. My cousin and I were out in Glenpool, towards the boondocks where my grandparents used to live, watching TV late at night. We weren't really tired, hyped up on caffeine from Pepsi and Sprite, just hanging out and trying to see how long we could go without passing out to sleep. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, or my cousin thought I was being a jerk and screwing around. But the louder the sound got, and closer, that's when we both turned the volume down. We then went to turn to each other and ask the same question. Was that you? Did you hear that? Of course, it was like a scratching, shuffling sound outside, and we both dismissed it, thinking that perhaps it was the family pets or wild animal, since the house was out in the middle of nowhere. Instead, curiosity got the better of us. I suggested maybe it was a ghost, and she promptly crawled towards the window for a peek. She didn't say anything, standing still, like if she moved something would see her. I started to talk, but she silenced me with a wave of her hand. When I got over to the glass, I stared off into the black yard. expecting to see a deer or something. Instead, what I saw was a thing. Best word used to describe it. It was all black, nearly invisible in the shadows it clung to. The only way we were able to see it all was due to a distant light pole. It was skirting around. I guess the dogs must have felt the tension in the air, because at that moment, they all went into wild barks at this intruder. It swung its head, or what seemed like a head, towards the sound of the barks, then up to the window we both watched it from. There was nothing there, no face, nothing at all. Needless to say, both of us were terrified to see a hooded, faceless figure staring back at us. It disappeared, melting into the shadows. The dogs yipped, dashing for cover. Both me and my cousin were cold, shocked, afraid, and speechless. We don't know what it was looking for in our yard, or what it was at all. I used to believe it was a person thinking of robbing our house, or at least I tell myself that so I don't get freaked. Though the truth seems a lot creepier, it is still the truth, and neither I nor my cousin can deny that. When I was 11 years old, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to hear the sound of my dad plowing our driveway. He soon left for work, and I couldn't fall back asleep. After all was quiet, I got out of my bunk bed and climbed down my stairs and walked into the hallway. I went to the bathroom and then back to my room. I climbed into bed and crawled over towards my pillow. It was then that I turned around and was about to pull my blankets over me when I noticed two bright green lights in the corner of my room, directly in front of me. They were glowing and hovering in the same spot I just walked through. I was confused and tried to think of all the possible things they could be. Smoke alarm light? Glow-in-the-dark plastic stars? Anything? I started to get more scared as the time passed, because I tried to eliminate the fact that it could be a spirit. I tried to figure out if it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Perhaps I saw the lights from a clock, and my eyes just needed to adjust to the darkness. I didn't turn any lights on while I got up. I blinked my eyes in a different spot on my wall, and tried to see if the lights would follow my eyes. They didn't. At this point, I looked back to the spot and there they were. I was so scared. They were eyes, and they were staring at me. I was terrified. I couldn't move at all. I was laying down resting on my elbows, just staring at them. They moved forward a foot or so, very slowly. Then, they moved back, and just as slowly, vanished to the left through my wall. I was so scared they would come back, and that's the end of the story. Riverdale Road has a lot more than just that certain place by 132nd. Riverdale Road is spooky throughout the entire road. It's weird. Sometimes the road stretches and shrinks. The bad side of the road actually starts on 104th, North Glen, and goes all the way to the end of the Highway 7, Boulder. But anyway, from 104th to Highway 7 is approximately 13 to 15 miles. I was paying attention to the mileage, and I was going about 35 to 40 the entire time. I started at 104th, and by the time I got to Highway 7, I had only gone 9 miles when I turned around to go back the other way towards 104th again. When I got there, I went 16 miles. Now tell me that isn't creepy. If you pay real close attention to the road, you could almost see it stretching. There's also this turn called Dead Man's Curve. It's a real sharp turn. The recommended speed is 25, but easily done at 40. There's a cement block wall bordering one side of the turn. If you turn that corner around 2:30 a.m., you will see a woman in the middle of the road, holding her hands up, waving for you to stop. When I went around that corner, I didn't have time to stop because she's right there after you do a half 90-degree turn. I ended up hitting her. I got out of my car and looked all around. Absolutely no one was around, but there were handprints on the hood of the car. Also, if you turn onto Riverdale from 112th and turn left, there will be a huge line of trees on the either side, and it just looks like a dark cave of trees. And there's a very mean jogger spirit that hitchhikes and jogs around there. My sister and I were driving around on that road and went through that little cave of trees, and she said she first got a glimpse of the light on his shoes on the left side going away from 104th, and as you get closer you can see that it's a person, and he was holding out his hands for hitchhiking. Then all of a sudden knelt down in the running position, and as soon as we got close enough, he jetted out in front of us. My sister said that there were bodily fluids and body parts all over on the windshield, and she blinked, and it was all gone. She said as soon as he knelt down getting ready to run, she saw that his face was just a skull, and his hand was bones. So yeah, it's not just that spot right by 132nd. There are millions of ghost and spirit stories for that road, believe me. I've gone up and down that road billions of times. I used to do it about 5 to 7 times a day for about a year, so I know that road pretty well. I moved to Overland Park, Kansas, during my 6th grade year, along with my brother, stepfather, and brother. The 5-story house we lived in was in a new neighborhood, and I never took the time to research the land on which our neighborhood was built. Of course, I didn't know what experiences I would find myself in throughout the next few years. My night's routine consisted mostly of sitting in the sunroom on the 4th floor that looked towards the hallway leading to the 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a linen closet, and the staircase which led to the master bedroom, while reading whatever book I had at hand. I can't recall how long it had been since my family and I moved into the house. However, I remember this night clearly. My parents went out to eat, and I stayed behind, at home. I was curled into the corner of a sofa that sat in front of a set of windows, reading Guardian by John Saul. The first incident happened well after the night sky had darkened. I was concentrating heavily on my book when I began to hear knocking coming from outside. It sounded almost exactly like someone hammering on the side of the house. Looking up from my book, I turned and looked outside to see who could be outside at such a time. However, I couldn't see anyone, so I turned around and made myself comfortable to engross myself in my book. Again, the banging continued, and the most effort I put into looking out the window again was angling my head and looking out of the corner of my eye. After a few minutes, the sound outside stopped, only to begin inside. This time, it sounded as someone was banging a hammer on the pipe in the basement, 3 floors below. The banging was 4 or 5 short clangs, and then silence. I'd raised my book again until I was interrupted by another round of clangs. The only thing I could do was try my best to ignore it. As I continued to read, I experienced this unnerving feeling of being watched. I tried to reposition myself on the couch, shifting my legs from underneath me and stretching out, but nothing would unshake their presence. I finally set it on propping my feet on the table, and resting the book on my knees. It was then where I could see in my peripheral vision a man standing on the top step of the staircase leading to my parents' bedroom. He stood in complete black, perfectly still, and watched. When I looked directly at him, he disappeared. I figured all the noises in the man I saw were a result of reading the book, and because of this conclusion, I refused to look up at the staircase again, regardless of the fact that the man was still there. I never spoke of the clanging or the man once my parents came home, because I figured it was my imagination. My parents were arguing when they came home anyway, so I tried my best not to get in their way. Most of my time was spent in my room when there were others in the house. You could blame it on adolescence and wanting to be by myself. It was there in my room where another strange incident occurred. I had my radio cranked to the highest decibel and was rocking out when I heard a knock on my door. Turning down the radio, I rushed to the door and opened it to find no one standing outside. I shrugged, thinking I was hearing noises due to the loud radio, closed the door, and cranked the radio back up again. A few minutes later, I heard the knocking again, but this time, instead of turning down the radio, I opened the door while the radio blared. Again, no one stood at my door. I walked into the bathroom, which was immediately to my right, and checked behind the drawn shower curtain because my mother would love to hide and jump out behind me as I walked down the hallway. Well, she wasn't going to get me this time, only she wasn't behind the curtain. I walked down the entire hallway, checking the kitchen and bedrooms before going to my parents' bedroom. It, too, was empty, so I hightailed it to my bedroom, shut the door, and sat on my bed. I figured whoever wanted to come in would, so I no longer answered the knocks. Whoever it was knocked twice more and then stopped. Months passed, and the knockings continued, and the man stood on the top step of the staircase. After a while, I became so used to it, but I never mentioned it to anyone in my house. I always figured it was my mind playing tricks on me. Eventually, the sounds and the man disappeared, and I never experienced them again until years later. My mother and I were standing on the back porch one night while she smoked a cigarette. No one was allowed to smoke inside because my younger brother was asthmatic. While she smoked, she mentioned, "I see people in this house." I casually looked at her and replied, "You too?" I can't remember the look on her face, but the sound of her voice distinguished her fear. She told me that she continuously saw 3 people standing on the staircase leading to her bedroom. Only the people she saw were dressed in white. She said that the people she saw stood on the stairs day and night, whereas the person I saw was dressed in black and only stood at the top of the stairs at night. She told me of a night when she was smoking in the garage, and she heard a knocking on the door. Figuring it was her husband, she knocked back in return. Moments later, another knock, and she returned it, and again, until the door opened, and her husband asked why she was knocking on the door. Her answer was, "Because you were knocking." He informed her that he had been downstairs watching television. A year or so after I shared our experiences, my mother and brother, and me, of course, moved out of the house and into an apartment across the street from the neighborhood. My mother and her husband were separated, but he continuously stayed at our apartment anyway. One night, my mother decided to drive back to the house to feed our dog that we left behind at the house, while my stepfather was inside our apartment sleeping. I remained behind as well, sitting outside in the back patio. My mother was gone for 10 or 15 minutes before rushing back through the front door. The hairs on her arm were standing on edge, and she couldn't seem to collect her thoughts. She finally asked, "Do you think I'm crazy?" I laughed and asked why. She explained. While the dog was eating out in the garage, she had gone inside to close the blinds in the formal living room. While her back was the rest of the room, she heard a distant voice saying, "Get out of the house." She said she shook it off and walked up to the sunroom to close more blinds, where she again heard, "Get out of the house." Finally, while closing the blinds in the kitchen, she said that the voice was so close that she ran out of the house without closing the remaining blinds, jerked the dog into the garage, and sped back to the apartment. A year later, we moved to Georgia, where there have been no experiences in any of the houses we've resided in. I've been debating with myself as to why she and I would see people standing on the same staircase, and if their different clothing represented anything. Maybe because that's where most of my parents' fights would take place, or what was trying to get our attention by knocking on the walls. What I do know is that now that my mother is no longer married to the same man, we haven't experienced anything of the like since. My ex-boyfriend lived in a very old part of town, in a house that was built in the 1800s. At one time, the home had been a stately and elegant one, with a long and gracefully curving stair as the focal point upon the entrance into the foyer. Through time, and with the coming of rough economic periods, the home grew into disrepair and was eventually sectioned off into a two-family home. One side housed a family of bikers, whose moonshine sent many a folk into orbit. We didn't have any moonshine the night this happened. And then the other lived my boyfriend and his roommate. One night, myself, my boyfriend Nick, Nick's friend Dave, and my friend Stacy, who was dating Dave at the time, were at the house. We were descending the grand staircase I mentioned earlier, on our way out to enjoy our Saturday night. All was dark, except for the soft lighting coming from the kitchen, which was illuminating the front doorway. On the front door, we saw the unmistakable silhouette of a woman in a long old-fashioned hoop skirt, like women wore in the 1800s. She scared the wits out of me and Stacy, and we both refused to go any further down the stairs until the rest of the lights were put on. Chickens, aren't we? Although Nick and Dave were in a position to see the woman's shadow, for some strange reason, they were unable to see her. Maybe she only liked women, but I know this for a fact. The next moment we actually saw the woman. It looked as if we saw her with her eyes gouged out, and she was running towards us, flying down the hallway. It was actually pretty creepy, but it happened in the corner of my eye, so I don't know if I was hallucinating or I actually saw her full steam ahead, but it definitely creeped me out. Another moment. My friend Stacy was upstairs, and the door was completely wide open, the bathroom door that is, and she saw that same woman in Victorian-era clothes just laying in the bathtub with, again, her eyes gouged out. I honestly don't understand what happened to this woman. At first I thought it was pretty innocuous, but now I understand. She must have been murdered. There's no other explanation I had than that. Thanks for reading, and I hope you enjoyed the story. I've always been hesitant to talk about this story, but what I tell you is true. In 1992, when I was separated from my wife for the first time, I was living at Old Farm in an apartment. One Saturday night, when my kids were off to their grandmother's, and my girlfriend, who was a teacher,
had an event to attend. I found myself in my apartment, all alone. I rented a couple of movies, ordered a Pizza Hut, went on over to the whirlpool for a while, and sat down to enjoy a peaceful night, alone at last. I was really looking forward to a night by myself. When I was reading in bed, I noticed a black silhouetted figure standing in my bedroom door. The figure appeared to have a cloak drawn over its head. I couldn't recognize any features, nor was there any attempt to verbally communicate. I was wide awake, and I was terrified. My heart was racing, and I kept pulling the covers over my head. It seemed like every second was one of terror. The figure stood in my doorway well into the morning hours, and I knew my eyes were as big as they could get. When the silhouette disappeared, I was covered with sweat. My hair was rain wet. I rushed out to the front room because I really couldn't believe it had left me. No, the only thing I had to drink was a Diet Coke with popcorn. I'm not a big drinker. After the ordeal, I quickly showered and raced off to go hiking. I can honestly tell you that no communication with the figure was made. When I would ask who you are, there was no response. This went on all night until, by the grace of God, it went away. This event has always affected my life. I know of another person who had a similar experience like mine. Can you tell me what was standing in my door, why there was no communication, and why me? Have you ever had any stories like this reported to you? Until now, the only person I ever told this story to was a good friend who is a Catholic priest. It still scares me to tell this story. Why was there no attempt to communicate? And yes, when I checked my doors, they were all bolted and locked. My father loved the state of Maine. Not enough, however, to give up his cush job in Boston to live on the going wage of a down-easter. So every summer, from the mid-50s until I reached high school, we would vacation on the scenic Maine coast. Very seldom will we stay in the same place twice. Usually, it was some remote cottage located on the outskirts of some tiny coastal town. A 2-week ordeal was in store for me, with no TV or friends to speak of. To keep me sane, my mother would buy me comic books and play board games with me, long into the night. We'd been at this cottage now for about 10 days, and I was counting the hours until we would leave. It was a chilly August night, and dear old Dad had a few too many and drifted off to bed. Our terrier, Joe, was snoozing on the carpet in front of the fireplace, and through the big picture window, the surf was something out of a South Pacific movie. The waves were gently breaking on the rocky shore, not 20 yards from the cottage. The only sound was the reverie coming from a cruise ship that was passing off the point. In summary, the night was calm. Suddenly, Joe jumped to his feet with his hackles up and growled at the door. I yelled at the dog to be quiet as he interrupted me over a card game. In an instant, the front door blew open, and with a bang, it hit the interior wall. Just then, a ghostly presence entered through the doorway. He looked as if he was from the Colonial era, had a musket in his hand, and seemed as though only half his face was visible, even though the figure itself had a blur to it. This lasted a few seconds, then the figure disappeared, like a fog that evaporated. Joe cowered, and my mother's hair moved, like it had been ruffled by some invisible breeze. The playing cards scattered about, and before we could take a breath, the door slammed shut, and Joe went back to his sleeping position.
we decided not to tell the old man, as he wouldn't believe it anyway. A few days later, we were filling up the old Plymouth for the return trip to Boston, and my father started gabbing with the local about his vacation. With the windows of the car down, we heard every word. "So where did you stay?" the man asked, with the Maine dialect. "Oh, down on the point at the Jensen cottage," my old man answered. "Folks around here know that place well," the man said flatly. "They refer to it as the front door." My name is John. I'm 41 years of age and currently live in the city of Lincoln, England. During my life to date, I've seen several ghosts, and whilst I still find them surprising and of course fascinating, I'm no longer afraid of whatever they are or appear to be. I saw my first ghost at around the age of 8 whilst having in my childhood home, a large Victorian house on the edge of Manchester, England. The ghost was one of a young boy of a similar age to mine at the time. He was leaning over the banister rail of the stairway landing outside my bedroom as I was making my way up to bed. The shock and surprise of seeing him sent me flying downstairs into the front room of my house. Needless to say, that none of my family appeared to believe what I told them I had seen. Although over the years, I've experienced strong sensations of ghostly presences, my next positive encounter was not until I was 22, whilst living and working in the city of Newcastle. I'd obtained the keys to a vacant industrial building, which my firm was taking over. My job was to assess the work involved in converting the building for its future use. I'd locked myself in the building and was therefore sure that no other person was on the premises, and was proceeding up some steep and narrow stairs when I felt a hand touch me on the top of my head and give my hair a friendly ruffle, rather like an affectionate parent may give their child. I immediately turned around, only to find the stairway completely empty. Surprised, but not afraid this time, I continued my inspection of the building. We moved into the premises, and although I had my office at the top of the stairs where I had my encounter, and worked there often late into the night, I never saw, heard, or felt anything unusual there again. My next encounter took place right here in Lincoln, about 3 years ago. Walking our dog out late one night, I noticed the cyclist approaching me along a side street. I thought the cyclist appeared a little unusual, insofar as he was riding an old-style, sit-em-up-and-beg cycle. His hair looked rather old-fashioned too, and most curiously of all, he appeared to be wearing an old-style Royal Air Force uniform. I could see the streetlight reflecting off the silver buttons on his uniform tonic, and from the chrome handlebars of his cycle. He got to within about 30 yards of me, when for some reason, I glanced down for a second. When I looked up again, he had completely disappeared from the street, and there was no way in which he could have left the street in the vicinity of where I last saw him. I wonder whether his appearance was, in some way, connected to the fact that there used to be an open-air swimming pool adjacent to where I saw him. This pool is very popular with air crews during World War II, and I can only assume he may have been on his way for a midnight swim. My most recent encounter was very brief, occurring during the first time I visited my mother's cottage in North Wales. Built around 200 years ago, the back room opens directly out into the rear garden, with the narrow stairs descending into the back room right beside the back door to the building. Whilst coming down the stairs, I saw an elderly woman walk through the back door and disappear. She was aged about 80, approximately 5 foot tall, wearing a gray dress with long sleeves, a white apron, and her straight gray hair was tied up in a sort of bun which in turn was covered by a small handkerchief on the top of her head. She was followed immediately by a young girl, aged about 10 or 12, dressed in a long light colored smock. Her hair was very long, blonde and straight, falling down her back. She also disappeared straight away. I've no idea what ghosts are or why they appear. I do not see them as threatening. In fact, on more than one occasion, a curious sensation of contentment seems to fill the air after they have gone. I've noticed that my mind is not thinking about anything in particular at the times I've come across them. Thanks for reading. I grew up in Western New York and knew the local legends of ghosts. The Rochester Durant White Lady, for example. I never really put much faith in them. I never had an experience until I left New York. In October of '99, I was transferred to Elyria, Ohio. After a few weeks, I was asked to work in Sandusky. I accepted the promotion, but having just settled into a new apartment, I decided to commute rather than move again. Halfway between Elyria and Sandusky, there was a rest stop on I-90, Route 2, just outside Vermilion. I would stop sometimes on the way home for a bathroom break or rest a bit. It's a funny design. You drive around and park in back of the building, between the building and wooden walking trails. I usually got off work after about 11 p.m., but it was usually pretty busy, so I never gave much thought to stopping there late at night. One night, in March of this year, I'd stopped for a bathroom break. I noticed that there was only a few cars in the lot. It was a warm spring night. I wondered why more people weren't out. As I returned to my car, I had this urge to walk into the wooded area, a stupid thing to do, as it would be easy for a human assailant to hide on the trails. I walked in about 10 feet, and the path split to the left and straight ahead. I walked a little further straight ahead and felt something in there with me. I turned and started to walk out when I heard a noise, kind of like a lumbering sound. Feeling foolish and thinking there was probably an animal, like a hedgehog or deer, walking through the woods, I looked back and saw a pair of yellow eyes on the path quite a whiles back. I knew it could not be an animal, as only the parking area was lighted. The only light in the woods came from the ambient light and the moon. I quickly closed the distance between myself and the parking area, keys in hand. To my relief, nothing pursued me, and the eyes were gone, or at least I couldn't see them anymore. I went straight home. The next day, I felt rather silly. Thinking about the matter during the day, none of it seemed like it should have scared me. I rationalized the whole thing. That night, I stopped for a bathroom break. Feeling brave, I decided to once again check out the woods and dispel my fear once and for all. This time, I walked out only halfway to the fork, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I was not afraid in the usual sense, rapid heartbeat, sweating, etc. I just had this feeling of not being able to walk any deeper into the woods. It was like the air got heavier the further I walked. As I walked out of the woods, the feeling went away, just as it had come. I decided to come back on my day off and investigate during the day. I'd never been in the day, and I didn't know where the trails led or what was in the woods that attracted people to them. I returned a few days later with my jogging shoes, ready to explore. The trails wrapped around to each other and only totaled a mile loop. There was a ledge, a cliff area, but it was fenced off and there was no way to get down, but I could see a stream in the distance. I didn't feel anything strange at all. Nonetheless,
I made it a point not to stop there after dark. A few months later, I was transferred to Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which leads me to my next story. But we are still looking into it, and it's AM now, so I need some sleep. And this is a true story. And this happened to me when I was 8 years old. I'm now 28, with 3 kids of my own. It happened in my hometown of Soak Village, Illinois, which is known to be a place that Indians pass through, using South Trail to get to other destinations. At least, that's what the official story is. There are others, like myself, who believe more. We believe that Indians actually settled there, if only for brief periods of time. There's always been talk of bones being found when a pool is dug up or a garden was put in, but most say it's just that. Talk. Not me. I believe it. I also not only believe, but know that the ground the Soak Village is residing on is sour, cursed, beyond anybody's wildest dreams. And I have many stories to support that belief. But for now, I will start with my first story of proof. It was a cold, normal night in the season of autumn, cold enough to keep you inside your house and snuggled under a blanket. I was doing exactly that. An 8-year-old can only do so much during these times, and I chose to do my homework so I could read later. I'd been listening to a Rick Springfield album on 8-track. I was playing it on my 2XL robot toy. This was a toy that you could put 8-track cartridges in that was made by the company to be a sort of trivia game. You'd play the cartridge, and it would ask you questions and tell you jokes. It had 2 big red robot eyes that flashed red when you were correct. It had 3 buttons you could push to answer your questions. 2XL could also play normal, 8-track music, and of course, its red robot eyes flashed in time with the music. So it was doing exactly just that on that cold autumn night, flashing its eyes to Rick Springfield, and I was quite contented. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor of my house and faced north, along with my bed. I had a window north of me and east of me. Of course, it was dark outside, but it was so warm inside and so very comforting. Every now and again, I'd look up from my homework and just look out into the darkness. No reason. It was just something I did. Well, this was the last time I ever did that again in that house. As I was sitting there, all of a sudden, I felt instantly cold, and every single hair in my body was raised. My blood felt like it had ran cold and decided to just stop pumping through my body. My heart was racing. I was perfectly terrified, and I didn't even know why. Yet, my 2XL was suddenly stuck, and it kept playing the same verse from Rick over and over. Hole in my heart. And its eyes weren't flashing anymore. No, they were just burning bright red, blood red. Then I felt this magnetic pull, like something was pulling me to my right. I turned my right head and looked out the east window and saw something that haunted me for the rest of my life. Sitting just barely outside my window, levitating, was the most horrifying image I'll ever see in my life. A creature, about 2 feet tall, but sitting Indian style. His skin was snowy white, and you could see the outlines of his bones because he was that skinny. He wore some sort of white cloth draped sideways on his body. This is why I later named him Gandhi Monster. My young mind thought his skinny body and his white cloth looked like the real Gandhi's did. This creature's head was too big for his body. His 2 horrible, big dark eyes were piercing my soul as he stared at me. He opened his mouth
and grinned a grin at me that haunted my dreams for years. His mouth was full of long, snarly, razor-sharp looking teeth, dripping with blood. I don't know how a mouth could fit so many nasty teeth into it, but it did. I watched as the blood dripped from his teeth and slid down his chin and onto his white cloth diaper shorts. He raised his hands and reached for me. The fingernails were at least 4 inches long, gnarled looking, and sharpened to points, also dripping with blood. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I was locked into place by his piercing eyes. I couldn't breathe. I felt as if my brain was being scrambled and my soul was being raped. His grin became larger, and he opened his mouth wider. He kept looking at me, as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting for me. He started to lift his arms, and it looked as if in seconds he would actually be inside my room and not just outside my window. All traces of reason disappeared, and my mind snapped. I still don't know how I did it, but I managed to tear my gaze away and leap off the bed and out my bedroom door, screaming with every inch of my soul, all in like 2 seconds. I could feel him pulling me. I could feel that horrible stare penetrating my back as I screamed down the hallway to my mother. Of course, when her and my father and younger brother came back, it was gone. But they knew I saw something, and they did not try to tell me it was my imagination. They comforted me and taped up all the windows in my room. They actually had to pull down all the shades and seal all sides with duct tape. I couldn't even sleep in that room for almost a year. My brother even remembers coming into the room with my parents afterwards. The Gandhi monster was a story we didn't often tell, but it always brought fear to speak of it, to us and to others. My parents never spoke of it again either. As I grew up, I tried to face my fear and sleep in that room, but never did I sleep with my back to a window. Never. 18 years later, I moved to Florida with my own little family, and have found peace within myself. But I'll never manage to forget that creature, and I'll never sleep or sit with my back to a window, and I will never forget the one thing I heard it say to me in my mind as I was running out of my bedroom door. Someday, I'm coming back. Hey, I'm in my mid-teens, and I've experienced ghostly encounters. The one that really freaked me out was when me and my family moved to Scotland. For a few months, we lived in chalets. Me and my older sister shared one on our own. A few weeks after we moved in, we began to feel uncomfortable and felt as if we were being watched there, and there was also a threatening atmosphere. We told our parents, and they said it was just because we were next to the graveyard. A few weeks later, I was lying in my bed with the door open when a tall, dark figure stood, leaning over me. I didn't think at that particular moment, but it wasn't until my sister asked me if I felt somebody was in my room the previous night. We started to talk, and she too felt as if somebody tall was leaning over her. I then started to sleep in my sister's room, and the figure didn't return, so I moved back into my own room. But then again, the figure returned this time. It was kneeling beside me. The next morning I told my sister, and again, she felt the presence of a tall man. Our dad told us that the large house next to us was where the Vikers used to stay until the house was sold. One night, my mom came in, and she was holding 2 necklaces with crosses on it. Me and my sister aren't religious, so her mom thought it had something to do with that. So we went to bed, holding the crosses. That night, it was very uncomfortable in both rooms. After that, we haven't felt the presence of the tall man. The figure that visited did so on a few occasions. Each time, it felt as though it was getting closer and more angry. When the crosses were given to us that night, the figure seemed very angry. Its face was literally pressed into mine, and it felt as if he was gritting his teeth at me. My sister also had this very uncomfortable, menacing figure who was pressed into her face. All you could do was hide under the guilt, closing your eyes really tight, and hope you'd fall asleep quick. Since that last visit, nothing has returned, and we've since moved then, and nothing. We don't even use the crosses anymore. Other things that we didn't think of as being connected at the time now do seem connected, such as the chalet that Mom and Dad were in, although the same, was different in feeling. Because Mom and Dad's chalets always had a comfy feeling, yet ours didn't. Whether it was because there was just me and my sister alone in there, and it was our imaginations or not, we don't know. Although in Mom's and Dad's chalet, there was only one more person over there. From the moment we stepped into the chalet, it was always cold, even with the heaters on. Plus, there was often a bad smell wafting around, a lot like fish, rotten. This was only in my bedroom, possibly me, my sister says. Also in my room, there was a strange noise of scratching, as if someone was sketching or writing. This noise accompanied the presence of another figure, smaller in stature and of the female sex. My sister also felt the smaller presence, but not the noise. She only came once, very different, not menacing, quiet in nature, and much older. She was almost a comfort. But it's still not nice to be watched over at night by ghostly figures. It's strange, because we didn't actually see anything, yet you get so much from these feelings, the sex, age, angry, happy, etc. Plus, we get almost exactly the same feelings. But is it just our imagination? Are we certifiably insane? Are we demented? No, we definitely feel we had a visitor. Previous to this experience, my sister had not really believed in it, ghostly visits and such, but now, I think she has had a change of mind. Me, myself, I've always believed. My mom's granddad often visits, a kind presence, bringing good luck, such as when she was having problems. He visits to let us know everything will be okay. He often visited when we were babies, watching over our cots. Our dad also saw what appeared to be him. Whenever he visits, we know him by the distinct smell of putty. He used to repair windows. So really, we are used to the visits, although my sister had never experienced any until now. Unfortunately, it wasn't a happy experience, one not to forget. Happened to surf onto your website, and I just wanted to let you know that I saw Resurrection Mary in Justice, Illinois, back in October of '92. After getting off of work at 3 a.m. from a chemical plant, Whitco Corporation, near 51st and Central in Chicago, I was driving by that particular cemetery at about 3:30 a.m. on my way home from work. Driving by, but initially not thinking much of the sight, as there was a nightclub with women of ill repute nearby. I saw a woman in a light blue or white palm dress standing by the trunk of what looked like a black park limousine at the front SW Cemetery driveway off Archer Avenue to the cemetery. I slowed down quite a bit to get a better look at the odd sight, but then drove off. I thought it was probably a prostitute with her John. However, looking back at my mirror, maybe a second later, the woman and the limo were gone. Let me reassure you that there was no way that I would have missed the limo driving off in that second that it took me to look back in the mirror. They weren't on the road or in the cemetery because I looked for taillights. The cemetery gates are pretty large, and it would have taken a great effort and time to open both of the cemetery gates for the car to get through. I did not think much of the incident until a few days later. I was talking with some of my employees that lived in the area near the cemetery. Two of my employees mentioned that I'd probably seen the ghost called Resurrection Mary. I didn't much believe in ghosts until that incident, and I'm still somewhat skeptical, but I cannot fully explain what I saw that night. That incident is still vivid in my memory and kinda creepy to think about it to this day. Ever since I can remember, I've always had an interest in ghost stories. That is why I'm writing you this letter. No, I don't have a ghost in my house. A friend of mine told me about this place at least 10 months ago. I was so amazed at this story, I asked if he would take me to this place. No one really ever goes there. I guess because it's so creepy and dark looking at night, but during the day, it is okay. Nothing strange happens. Well, first, before I tell you more about this place, let me tell you the story of why it is so unusual. The city is called Lake Forest, California, and they call it Canyon Creek, I guess, because it is nothing but canyon and wide open spaces of nothing but rocks and wildlife. The story goes back 30 years ago of a lady who was in her 40s. Nobody knew what her name was. She lived alone with her two Great Dane dogs. She was very rich and owned all of the canyon, which is like miles and miles of land. This lady never married and had no children. It was just her dogs and herself. She lived in this trailer park home, and it was not a pretty house by any stretch of the imagination. Well, about 6 years later, the story goes that a police officer got a call about the lady and her dogs. The officer went to the lady's home and knocked at the door, and no one answered. The officer ended up breaking down the door, and what he found next was horrifying. It is said that the officer found the lady dead. Nothing was left but her decaying body, and her bones were visible. Worst of all, laying right next to her were her dogs. They had both died as well. Now, on to the paranormal part. People who have never been to this place don't know what to expect if they come into this place. It's unpredictable. Sometimes, when you go back to the area where she passed, you'll notice paranormal phenomena. Other times, you won't. A man was driving alone on the canyon by himself one night, and the story goes that he saw the presence of the lady standing at the side of the road with her two dogs. The man did not stop at all to give the lady a ride. He just kept going. This other story was told by my friend. My friend told me that his ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend went up there one night to check it out. They stopped where the lady's house was. They were only there about 15 minutes away when they were just talking and listening to music. Then, all of a sudden, they heard a knock on the side door of the driver's seat. They both turned to look, and they saw the lady standing there, knocking on the window. She was dressed in all white and covered in blood. They also saw the dogs nearby as well, far off into the distance, appearing as silhouettes. They sat there in shock for 3 minutes, horrified by what they just saw. For some reason, the lady was still knocking at the driver's side of the window, but in reality, it was really not that long. They both said that she must have been there about 40 seconds. After that, my friend said they never returned back there. That was not the only story that happened to anyone. There are far more. What I would like to know is who is this lady and why is she doing this? There's something more to why she has to haunt people who have done nothing to her. Maybe it is because she does not want anyone on her land that she loves so much. What could it be? Here's my email address. If you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of me. I would like at least some kind of feedback on this story. Please, I beg you. I'm so confused, and I'm scared. Please let me know what is going on. I find this intriguing. I never shared this story before, but this seems like the right place to do it. When I was born, my parents rented a portion of a 3-family house. The house was huge and previously owned by an old German woman. Apparently, the house belonged to the same family since the early 1700s when it was built. After the old German lady died there was no one left in the family to take on ownership of the house. Someone new took the house over and rented it out to 3 other families. As soon as we moved in, my parents had odd things happening on a daily basis. The TV and all of the lights in the house would constantly turn on in the middle of the night. One night, my dad had some friends over to watch a football game, and all of the power in the house kept going on and off. His friends were so freaked out that they left. What bothered my mom the most was that all the rooms in the house stayed warm, except for mine. My room was always like ice, and being a newborn, my mother was concerned. She would turn the heat way up, and still my room stayed cold. One night, she heard a woman's voice coming from my room. As she neared, she could hear an old lady singing a lullaby. When she opened the door, the rocking chair was swaying back and forth, and my room was warm. After this occurrence, my room remained warm. This became an ongoing thing in the house. The rocking chair would constantly rock, no matter where in the house my mom moved it to, and oftentimes she would hear a soft voice coming from my room. The lights continued to go on frequently in the middle of the night. As I got a little older, into the toddler years, I can still remember certain things happening. My parents found it odd that I am able to remember things so clearly. I can describe my bedroom in distinct detail, as well as the other rooms in the house. I only lived there from newborn to 2.5 years. One night, I woke up and felt absolutely terrified. I remember climbing out of my crib onto the little table and chair set, and stepped onto the floor and dodged for my parents' room. As soon as I climbed into bed with my mom and dad, I heard my aunt, who was asleep on the couch, screaming. My mom woke up and ran into the living room to see what all the fuss was about. My aunt kept crying, I saw her, over there by the lamp." Apparently, my aunt says that she saw the old lady standing at the foot of the couch by the lamp. When my mom reached over to turn the lamp on, she disappeared. All of my parents' old friends remember the house, and everyone has a story of something that they experienced there. We know that the old lady died in the house, probably in the section where we lived. At first, I think she was angered that the house no longer belonged to anyone in her family. She was harmless and just wanted to make her presence known. We only lasted there for 2.5 years. Sometimes we drive by the house and contemplate stopping in to see how the current owners are making out, but I never had the courage to go back. Here's some spooky experiences that I remember from my childhood. The first one didn't happen to me. It's something that my mother told me about. Her mother died in 1959. A few years later, she remembers waking up in the middle of the night and hearing her mother calling her name. This always gave me the chills, especially if I thought about it at night. When I was maybe 6 or 7, something happened that scared the living daylights out of me. I can still picture it in my mind. A short time after I went to bed, I was lying there awake, and I looked up at my bedroom door, which was closed. There was a window across the room from the door. The curtains were open, and the moonlight was shining through the window, making a square of light on the door. In the middle of the square of light, I saw the shadow of a hand slowly moving back and forth. I was so scared that all I could do was just stare at it. I was trying to scream, but no sound would come out. Finally, I managed to get my voice to work, and I yelled as loud as I could, "Mom!" My mother came running in, and I told her what I saw. I don't remember if she saw the shadow too. Probably not. She didn't see anything outside, and she shut the curtains. Now, there were no trees right outside my window that were close enough that they would make a shadow. Not to mention that this did not look like a tree branch. It was definitely the distinct shape of a human hand. Looking back on this as an adult, I realized that this was most likely not anything supernatural at all, but someone actually trying to break into our house, which, quite frankly, is more scarier than a mere ghost. When I started screaming, the person heard me and ran away. Shortly after the previous incident, I asked my parents if I could move into the room across from that one. Gee, I wonder why. My new room had a little trap door in the closet, leading to an attic of sorts. My parents never used it for storage, as it was too hard to go up there through the trap door, and it most likely wasn't even high enough to walk upright in. When I was about 10 or 11, my best friend and I were playing in my room, and we noticed that the trapdoor was open about an inch or so. We slid it closed. Every once in a while, I'd look up there and find that it was open again. I'd keep sliding it closed, and then a few days later, it would be open. My friend and I naturally assumed that we had a ghost in the attic. I really don't remember if I actually heard anything up there or not. Around the same time, this same friend would occasionally spend a night with me. Several times, we'd be lying in bed and hear the sound of a newspaper or some sort of paper being crumpled up in the living room when we knew no one else was up. We called this the newspaper ghost. Another time, I think I was about 7, I was riding my bike around in circles in the street. This was in a housing development where there was very little traffic. My aunt, uncle, and cousins were visiting, and I recall looking at the bathroom window on the side of our house and seeing my aunt's face looking out the window. Later, I mentioned it to my aunt, and she said she hadn't been looking out the bathroom window, and neither had anyone else. Now, I realized that this could have easily been a reflection of something in the window, but at the same time, it seemed pretty spooky to me. In the summer of '69, I was about 13. We had some relatives staying at our house for about a week. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I was still awake. As a child, it always took me a long time to get to sleep. I was always too wound up, I guess. Anyway, all of a sudden, there was this loud crash that came from my closet, like something metal or aluminum falling on the untiled floor. The thing that came to mind was a metal vacuum cleaner hose. There was no vacuum cleaner or any other large metal object in my closet that could have fallen and made such a noise, and even if there was, what would have made it fall off the shelf? I was too scared to get up and look in my closet or go and ask anyone if they'd heard it. Now, this was a small 3-bedroom house in Levittown, Pennsylvania. If anyone is familiar with the houses, if a loud noise occurs in any part of the house, it would be impossible not to hear it all over the house. The next morning, I asked my parents, aunt and uncle and cousins if they heard a loud crash in the night, and no one else had heard it. And by the way, I looked in my closet in the morning, and nothing was out of place. This has always puzzled me. Here are a few things that have happened in the last few years, in the house I live in now. Nothing blatantly scary, just weird. I thought I'd share them just for the fun of it. One night, I was asleep, and all of a sudden, I screamed and woke myself up. My husband came running in, and I couldn't for the life of me remember what I had dreamed that had scared me. But I had a vague memory of looking beside the bed and seeing something in the form of a human being, made up of little points of light. There have been a few occasions where I've woken up in the middle of the night and heard a kind of electrical humming that sounds like it's coming from our bedroom closet. My husband said he could hear it too. I could never figure out what's causing it. It sounds like it could be the refrigerator running, except that the kitchen is not right next to the bedroom. And if it was the fridge, wouldn't I hear the noise every night, since obviously the fridge runs all the time? I haven't heard it in over a year. Just as well, it gives me the willies. I want to say that I can sympathize with your situation, although other than apparitions, my experience varies greatly from yours. I do want to share what happened to me with you, but I do want to warn you ahead of time. I used to be a reporter, so I can get lengthy. My first experience happened when I was a child. I was 7 years old and lived a completely normal life. My parents didn't smoke dope or dabble in the occult, so I really had no knowledge of ghosts, other than the traditional Halloween experiences every child encounters. When I turned 7, my family moved from Metro Memphis, Tennessee, to rural Independence, Mississippi. We moved into a house that my father renovated. Rather than trying to draw a diagram that may get scrambled in transmit, I'll try to describe the layout of the rooms involved. The way the home was originally laid out, you walked in the front door into the living room. To the left was the kitchen, open without walls to the living room. To the right was a bedroom door. Straight ahead was a hallway leading to other bedrooms, laundry room, and bathroom. After my father was finished, the front door was added onto a new wing of the house. The living room was enclosed into a bedroom. The bedroom now directly led out into the hall, which now led to the kitchen also, and had a new doorway to the bedroom that previously opened up to the living room. Is that confusing enough? We moved into the house, and I immediately was terrified of my sister's bedroom, the one that had previously opened up into the old living room. I just felt that something was there, and it was watching me. I felt like it wanted to possess me or something stronger than a mere presence. Also, I never found out why, but hers was the only room with security bars on the window. No other family member noticed anything strange in the house. I ended up in the new bedroom, and sometimes at night, I'd hear noises. Being so small, I don't remember exactly what they were, but frequently, I'd see an incandescent, glowing form in the shape of a human walking across my room. What made me know that it had to be a previous occupant of the home was that it would walk from the bedroom I was so scared of, through my room, into the kitchen, the way the house used to be laid out. Once when my grandmother came to visit, my parents forced me to sleep in my sister's bedroom. I was so terrified, but I finally went to sleep. When I woke up, I saw what appeared to be an ectoplasm swirling above my head. I spent most of my childhood years terrified of sleeping. Being a middle child of an older sister and a younger brother, I'd hide my prized possessions, jewelry, money, whatever I thought I didn't want them to get a hold of. Almost every time I hide something, it would disappear and reappear later in a different location. Thinking my siblings had discovered my hiding place, I'd find a new one, each time to have them disappear and reappear once again. The really strange part came later. We sold the house when I was 13 to another girl's family I went to school with. After she'd move in, I'd asked her one day if she noticed anything weird in the house, and she said no, but her sister refused to go into the bedroom that scared me. Sister's explanation was that someone was watching her, and she was a middle child also. I guess there must have been some connection to middle children. I said something years later about the house being haunted in front of my aunt. She said she'd always had a feeling that something was wrong with the house. I'd appreciate your input as to what you think my experience meant. I had a person tell me one time I was a demon that wanted me, but I'm not even sure. While I lived there, although I was the only family member that had strange experiences inside the house, I wasn't the only one who had strange experiences in the area. In the fall, between the hours of 10 p.m. and 12 a.m., my mother would see balls of light floating in the field and wooded areas, across the road from my house. She would always ask me to come look, but I had enough terror inside the house, and as far as I was concerned, the woods were my only safe haven while at home. So I never looked and never witnessed the lights myself, but both my sister and my mom did. When I was 19, I started dating this guy who was friends with a neighbor from that house I'd lived in. Basically, he lived catty corner from me, with their house backing up to the woods mine faced. My new boyfriend asked me if I ever saw anything strange in the woods. I said no. He told me that his neighbor's kid, who was a friend of his, told him that he'd seen balls of lights in the woods. I then told my boyfriend about my mother and sister's experiences. So apparently, it wasn't just restricted to my family. Another experience I had was when I was in my early 20s, when my grandfather passed away. We'd always loved each other very much, but didn't have a close relationship because of my grandmother, whom I didn't get along with. I was present when he passed away and was devastated. 3 months passed, enough time to allow me to grieve and get on with my life. I was asleep one night and awoke to find my grandfather sitting on the side of my bed. He told me not to be scared, that he had a message for me. He told me I needed to get my life straight, or I was headed for trouble. I remember he held my hand and told me that he was going to tell me what heaven is like, but I'm not allowed to remember what he told me. I remember him being present for a while longer, but can't remember a word he said. Now that I'm an adult and have some time and distance between me and these experiences I had as a child, I'd like to try to discover what these experiences meant, or why I was chosen to have this one. Do you have any suggestions? Also, even now, I can drive by a place or house and tell that it's haunted. Does that mean that I'm psychic or paranormally gifted? Usually I just get kinda jumpy and frightened, but one night, I was out repossessing vehicles, something I did part-time for a while, and my partner pulled up to this house. I was so terrified of the house that I told him he better turn around immediately, or I was getting out of the vehicle and running. Please help me to understand what is going on with me. I'm finally getting to a point I accept it and want to understand it, rather than how I've been so terrified in the past that I didn't even want to talk about it. In 1983, when I was 18 years old, I was severely ill. I woke up one morning and my face was badly swollen. My mother took me to the emergency room. I was placed in the ICU the next day as I went unconscious. It would take a team of doctors over a week to finally diagnose me. It was a rare disease. There was only 2 case histories. They both died from it years before. That's why my doctors had no idea what it was. It was from a sinus infection that had backed up behind my brain. From this, I developed a brain abscess. The night before they would make the decision if I needed brain surgery to remove the abscess, I was lying in my hospital bed, praying that the abscess would have shrunk a little. I felt someone standing beside my bed. I was sure it was a nurse, as it was very late, too late for visitors. When I turned to talk, it wasn't a nurse at all. It was my grandfather, who died 1 year earlier. At that moment, I wasn't afraid. He said to me, "You'll be fine." When I asked if you were sure, he then replied, "Do you doubt me?" I replied, "No." He then said, "Everything will be fine. You will be alright." This part has puzzled me ever since he told me. He said, "Take care of your mother." This was my mother's father, and he simply turned around and walked out of the room. The nurses came in, and I was wondering what happened to my grandfather. They didn't say anybody walked into the room, and they told me to calm down. I swear I knew what I saw. I knew it was my grandfather, but the whole situation was just weird, and it gets weirder. I thought he meant that I would do fine through the surgery, my grandfather. Now here's the kicker. He had brain surgery about 7 years before his own death. Even crazier,
The next morning I had an x-ray, and they came to tell me that my abscess was completely gone. First of all, I have no idea what happened. Even the doctors were confused. They wanted to take even more x-rays, and I obliged, and they confirmed no abscess whatsoever. As for my grandfather talking about my mother, I had no idea why he was mentioning her. She was pretty healthy at the time, but it makes sense now. Recently, she has been diagnosed with MS, diabetes, and in September, she had heart failure. In November, she almost died and had triple bypass surgery. Through the years, my family has had many encounters with the spirit world, but this was the most wonderful one.
Hey Phantom, so really quick, I know I've been doing a lot of compilations lately, and for people who've been requesting them a lot, I decided to give you the longer video, so this is a little treat for you, and also because my voice, again, for some reason, it's on and off. I can never predict when these things happen, but it's not as good as I want it to be, so with that, I hope you really enjoyed the video that I just released. I hope you give it a like, I hope you share it, and I hope you subscribe if you're new. I don't even know why I said that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning in all the time, and I appreciate everything that you guys do for me. So here's something to fall asleep to, and I mean, if you made it this far, then you probably already fell asleep. But if you woke up, then here I am again, and I love you guys. I'll get back to the regular true scary ghost stories tomorrow, hopefully, maybe Monday or Tuesday at the latest, but my plan is to get this video out for you guys to enjoy and then get another set of ghost stories to work on for you all. So, love you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.